Jay Baba, welcome this morning. We're happy to have Daniel Stone with us, who's going to share an interview that he did this year, and I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'm happy to be here with you all to kind of introduce this video of the interview I did with Rick Archer. So I think a lot of people know this, but I was interviewed by Rick Archer on his program called the Buddha the Gas Pump, and it was done on April 15th. It's been seen now in video form by over 13,000 people, and on podcast, we're sort of assuming, at least half as many, if not the same number. So we're assuming like at least 20,000 people have seen this interview or listened to it. So if you're not familiar with Buddha the Gas Pump, and I'm going to call it BAT Gap, which is kind of what what it's called for short, it's a program that's been on for quite a number of years. It's done by a guy named Rick Archer, who's a very long time, has been very involved in transcendental meditation for many, many years, and then many other things as well. And it's a program where he interviews what he calls spiritually awakening people about topics about spiritual awakening. And if you go to his website, you'll see there are almost 700 people that have been interviewed there. And you can have access to any of those interviews through his website called batgap.com. Now, and he's got about 100,000 subscribers, or over 100,000 subscribers at this point. So he's pretty widely known in what I call the awakening subculture within, and not just in the US, but worldwide. So I want to share a little bit about how it was that I got to be interviewed by him, because I think you might find it to be of interest. And then we'll show the interview. And then at the end of the interview, I'll be back on. And if folks want to, for those of you who managed to stay on for the whole thing, because it's about 2 hours and 20 minutes, so it's a long interview. But if you manage to stay on for the whole thing, and I actually do encourage you to, because it's an interview that progresses as it goes, and the tone of it shifts, I think you'll see. But I think, when it's over, I'll be back here, and if for whoever's still here, I'm happy to, respond to any questions or hear any comments you guys want to make. So here's how I got to be invited to be on this. I've been a member of a group for 10, 12 years now called the Evolutionary Leaders Circle. And it's a group of people who are involved in sort of spiritual awakening kinds of things, or what is the term that gets used as conscious evolution. And it's a group of people, we get together in retreat settings and other kinds of things like that. And it's a group of people who, some of them are writers, speakers, workshop leaders, some practitioners, some of the names you would know very well, and some of the names you would not know so well, like Deepak Chopra is a member of it, just to give a flavor. But then there are many people like me who are not, we don't have any celebrity associated with our name or anything like that. But I've been in this group, as I said, for 10 or 12 years. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine in the group named Jeff Vanderkloot, who's really quite an extraordinary guy, told me that he's a very close friend of a fellow named James O'D. And he would go to visit James O'D in his home in Crestone, Colorado, and he would find these Baba books all over the place, God Speaks and Discourses. So he found out that James was actually very involved with Mayor Baba. So I'd never met James. James has Parkinson's, so he doesn't come to our retreats. And so James, but I was intrigued by that. And so I made it, so I got Jeff to introduce me to him, and I met him. And James is quite an extraordinary guy in it on his own. He was the head of Amnesty International in Washington, D.C. He was the CEO of the Seva Foundation, which is the organization that serves people with blindness in India and Nepal that Ram Dass set up. He was the CEO of something called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, started by the astronaut who was involved in sort of psychic things. I forget his name, but there's one of them that was very involved in that. And he set up this institute that James headed up, and it is one of the major institutes dealing with the research into paranormal phenomena. And James has also written several books, one called The Conscious Activist, which is just excellent. I highly recommend it. One called Cultivating Peace, which, I can make a lot of comments about that one and the importance of that book. And his most recent is called Soul Awakening Practice, which is dedicated to Avatar Meher Baba. So he's a very accomplished, person in that sense. So I was very interested to meet him. And he heard about Baba, by the way, through Mickey Singer. He was on Mickey Singer's board down in Florida, the Temple of Universal something. I did contact James. I think it's been over a year now, maybe a year and a half. And that began a friendship between us. And we get together every 2 or 3 weeks and we talk about Baba. And he lives in Crestone, Colorado, which is kind of a mecca for a lot of spiritual groups. And he lives in, amidst this mecca, and he's been wanting to share Meher Baba with people there. He's got Aurobindo people and Buddhists and all kinds of people there, but he's kind of the only Baba lover there. And so he asked me if I would do something to do a program to introduce people to Baba. So out of that, I created a program called Journey in Consciousness. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was done live, but also recorded online, and it's available online. It's 7 one-hour sessions that introduce Baba through the lens of consciousness. And by the way, that program is I'm going to deliver that I delivered it in Mehrabad in December, and I'll be delivering it the weekend of June 2nd through 4th on the center, if any of you are interested. At any rate, I did that program and got quite a few people there, including a lot of Baba lovers went to that program. But 2 of the people that went there were a couple named William and Brahmi Howell. And they are longtime followers, I believe, of Aurobindo, though I'm not positive. But they were very enthusiastic. They became Baba lovers. And it turns out Brahmi is a friend of Rick Archer's. And so they were talking between themselves, like, why is it that Rick Archer has this program of Buddha at the gas pump? And there are, all these people have been interviewed there, but nobody has interviewed the being who is responsible for all the spiritual awakening that's taking place, which is Meher Baba. Why is it that he's not represented on the program? So they asked me if I would be willing to be interviewed, and I said yes, and I agreed to that. And then they, along with James and my friend Jeff Vanderkloot, wrote to Rick Archer to recommend that I be interviewed. So Rick contacted me. He invited me on the program, and he asked me how he should prepare for the interview. So I gave him a reading list, and I said, Discourses, God Speaks, and I sent him a copy of a book called The Silent Messenger, which is the rewrite of a book called Much Silence by Tom and Dorothy Hopkinson. And I recommended that he read all of those, and I sent him maybe a couple of videos on YouTube about Baba's life and so on. And turns out he read almost everything. In fact, he would keep me posted before the interview what he'd read, and some of his reactions to some of what he read and so on. And some of it, I have to tell you, and you'll see this in the interview, he's a skeptic by nature. You'll see that. And he was particularly affected by an interview on Meher Baba in outer space, of a talk given by a man named Ray Kirchhoff in Australia, which is actually a very, very interesting YouTube video if you're looking for something to watch. And he was dubious about some of Baba's claims that Ray talks about in that. And so he was trying to poke and prod to see, well, if this man claims to be God, how could he be wrong about certain things? So that was a little bit of the nature of our pre-interview communications. And you'll see a little bit of that in the interview. I told him in advance, I said, that's not material I'm prepared to talk about. I said, I'm not grounded in that aspect of Baba. So, and then before the interview, the day of the interview, he sent me a list, a 4-page list like this, 4 pages of this, of the topics he wanted to cover. So that's what I had going into the interview. So, and you'll see in the interview kind of how he handles it. So that's kind of the background for the interview. I can't speak at all to the impact of it. As I said, I think it's fair to assume that about 20,000 people, give or take, have seen the interview or heard it on podcasting. Who knows what impact it has? As Eric used to say, it's our job to get Baba's name to their ears, and it's his job to take it from their ears to their heart. So this was my effort to bring Baba to people's ears. The only tangible impact I can speak to is I was giving a tour on the center a couple of weeks ago, and a couple showed up who had been vacationing in Murrells Inlet, and they'd listened to the interview on Buddha the Gas Pump, and when they heard that it said that there was a center for Mayor Baba in Myrtle Beach, they thought, well, we're so close, let's go there. So they came to the center, and I gave them a tour of the center. So that's the only tangible impact I can speak to, but you guys can see what you think yourselves. Okay, so with that, Ruthie, I'll turn it over to you to start us off, and then I'll be back when it's over. Jai Baba.
Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is an ongoing series of conversations with spiritually awakening people. We've done nearly 700 of them now. If this is new to you, please go to batgap.com, BATGAP, and look under the past interviews menu where you will see all the previous ones organized in several different ways. This also exists as an audio podcast if you like to listen to audio podcasts. And the whole thing is made possible through the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and would like to help support it, there's a PayPal button on every page of the website, and there's also a page explaining some alternatives to PayPal. Incidentally, since the last interview, we broke the 100,000 subscriber mark on YouTube, so that's nice. They sent us a plaque to congratulate us. So my guest today is Daniel Stone, and we're going to be talking about Mayor Baba. Daniel has been a follower of Mayor Baba most of his life. He lives in South Carolina, right close to a beautiful 500-acre compound that is a major center for the Mayor Baba organization. And I was just telling Daniel that I was talking to a friend this morning who had heard about Mayor Baba because Pete Townsend of The Who was into him, and supposedly very loosely based the character of Tommy from that rock opera on Mayor Baba, although Tommy bore no resemblance to Mayor Baba. But anyway, my friend, like when he was 12 years old, he asked his mother for Mayor Baba books for his birthday, and he was reading some very deep books. This is one I managed to get through most of in the past couple weeks. And I've also read this one, Silent Messenger, and have listened to many hours of talks by today's guests and some other things that he recommended I listen to. And I'd heard of Mayor Baba, of course, since I was in my teens, but all I knew about him was that he was said to be an avatar and that he spent most of his life not speaking. He maintained silence. And I never knew much more. So it's been interesting getting to know more about him over the past few weeks. And that's what we're going to do today. I've got a lot of notes here that I've developed as I read and listened to all this stuff. And we might move fairly quickly, but we're going to cover a lot of territory. So hang in there with us and feel free to ask your questions if you're in the live audience. So Daniel, welcome. And thanks for doing this.
Rick, thanks for having me. Thanks for the chance to share with you and your listeners about Baba. It's just a great joy to do this with you.
Yeah. So briefly, what's your spiritual history? You're roughly my age, a little younger maybe. And, how did you get onto spirituality and then ultimately onto Baba?
So, Rick, I'm going to give you a really condensed version of that. There's a much longer version, which folks can find on YouTube. But I was raised in what I would call a very agnostic, if not atheistic, Jewish intellectual household. So I really had no spiritual foundation myself. And it was in my teens when I was first exposed through psychedelics to the experience of that consciousness really could be something quite expansive and something quite beyond what my normal experience had been. And that really set me on a path of inquiry about that brought me in my later teens to starting to be exposed to and explore different kinds of Eastern kinds of mysticism and spirituality. I experimented and spent time doing TM, which I know you've been very involved with that in your life. Got involved with some Zen Buddhism, Kundalini yoga, different kinds of things like that, and worked with different teachers like Yogi Bhajan and Philip Kapleau in the Zen field and so on. And during that time, I heard about Meher Baba, I think through being given a copy of the discourses that Meher Baba wrote or Meher Baba gave out. And they were given to me by somebody I knew in a food co-op. I was living in Boston at the time. And I was very deeply impressed with the authority of Meher Baba's words. Not that he was trying to exert authority, but just it was clear to me that compared to all of the other writings and teachings I was being exposed to, this was most clearly from somebody who actually knew whereof he was speaking. And so I was very taken with that. So, but I was really in the mode of looking for a methodology or a process, and I wasn't finding that immediately with Meher Baba. So I kind of set him aside, even though he sort of occupied a place inside of me of interest. And then sometime later on, I went to a talk given by who at the time was called Baba Ram Dass now, and then later Ram Dass, formerly Richard Alpert, who had just come back from India where he had been with his guru. And he gave a talk about that experience. And I was very, very taken with what he said about his guru, who he called Maharaji. But it became apparent that Ram Dass wasn't going to reveal any identifying information about who this man actually was, even what his name was, much less where he was located. So even though I was keenly interested to find him and meet him, there was no avenue to do so. So I kind of set that aside. So later on, sometime later, a year later or so, a friend of mine, I was getting ready to move from Boston where I was living, and I was going to go travel around Europe. I had a girlfriend there at the time, and just to sort of find myself. And a very close friend of mine had become a Baba lover, a follower of Meher Baba. We call ourselves Baba lovers, and I'll explain that maybe a little bit later on. But he had become a Baba follower and was making his first trip to the center for Meher Baba in Myrtle Beach and wanted me to come with him. And I'm making a very long story short here. I went with him to the center, and I was not immediately, I could not find any way to follow Baba based on what I was hearing and seeing there. But we did have the opportunity to meet with a woman there who was one of the people who was one of the directors of the center, whose name was Kitty Davy. And Kitty Davy was at the time 80 years old. She was an English woman who had been one of Meher Baba's first Western disciples since the early 1930s and had lived with Meher Baba in India from 1937 until 1952. And then in 1952, Baba directed her to stay on at the center and help out with the running of the Meher Center. So all of us who went to the center for the first time met Kitty. And so I met Kitty along with my friend. And Kitty was the most normal looking person you can imagine. She was just a very nice, friendly, warm, but nothing unusual about her per se, English woman. And so we're sitting in her office and she's talking to me and she's talking to my friend, just trying to get to know us a little bit. And she asks me what I'm doing with my life. And I said, I'm getting ready to go to India. I'm getting ready to go to Europe and travel around. And she looked at me very piercingly and she said, you know, I think you are looking for something, in her very British voice. And at first I sort of said, well, maybe so. I don't know if that's really true. Then she turned to me a little later on in the interview. She said, I think you're looking for something. And I think if you go to Rishikesh in India, you'll find what you're looking for. Now, I didn't know what to make of that. And I just sort of, set it aside also in the interview and didn't think about it again. But on the way back, driving back from Myrtle Beach back north, I was thinking about the conversation with Kitty, and all of a sudden I had this kind of a thunderbolt came inside of me and said, she was exactly right. I should do exactly what she said. And so the next week I got on a plane and traveled to England, and then traveled from England overland to India to find my way to Rishikesh. And before I got to Rishikesh, I decided once I got to India that I would like to see a little bit of India and in that area. So I decided to do a trek in Nepal. So I went with somebody I met on the way there, and we did a trek out of Pokhara Valley in Nepal up to a place called Jamson. And it was a very desolate area. We were some of the first Westerners who had ever been there. And so we were trekking, 150 miles up and back to near the Tibetan border. And on the side of the path one day, a man comes by and he sits down next to us. He's kind of a hippie looking kind of guy. And he introduces himself and we talk about kind of what we're doing. And I find out he has just come from being with the man who was Ram Dass's guru. And he told me what his name was. His name was Neem Karoli Baba. And he told me where to find him, which was Nainital, India. So I logged that into my brain, but I said, okay, that's great to know. I took a note of it. And then I went on to Rishikesh. And I spent a couple of weeks in Rishikesh and kind of checked things out there and looked at the ashrams and checked out the scene. And I wasn't exactly finding anything there that appealed to me. But then I realized that Neem Karoli Baba was actually not that far from where I was. And so I said, well, before I decide to leave all this behind, let me go find Neem Karoli Baba. And so I took the bus from Rishikesh, found my way to Nainital, and then from Nainital went down in the valley below Nainital to a little village called Kanchi, which is where Neem Karoli Baba had a temple, a Hanuman temple there. And I went there and I came to Neem Karoli Baba. And that began a period of 4 or 5 weeks that I spent with Neem Karoli Baba and what was really a pretty small group of Westerners, I'd say 15 or 20 folks there, because again, he wasn't widely publicized. People didn't know who he was or where to find him, but I was able to be with him during that time. And being with Neem Karoli Baba was an extraordinary experience. And it was the fulfillment of what I was looking for, which was to find a genuine spiritual master and to experience a genuine spiritual awakening from him. And he gave me that awakening inwardly. It wasn't through any talk. It wasn't through any, quote, spiritual practice. It wasn't through any, private interview. It was not through anything like that. It was a completely inward experience that I had that he gave me that went way beyond anything I'd experienced on psychedelics in terms of the awakening of my heart in chambers that I just had never been aware that they were there. And so it was quite wonderful to be with him. But at the same time, I was with him for a number of weeks. And as the time went on, I felt that I felt a restlessness inside of me, like I can't actually stay here. And while most of the people that were staying with him in what some would call a satsang around him, I never felt that he was my guru as much love as I felt from him, and as much awakening and fulfillment. And so I felt like, with this restlessness, I felt like, I really need to leave. And I do feel that it was him inwardly prompting me to leave. That's my own interpretation of that. And so I thought, well, where should I go? I should leave here, maybe take a little vacation from being here, then come back. And so I was trying to decide, well, where should I go? And there were certain things, and I'm not going to go into all the different sort of coincidences or synchronicities or what have you, but there were enough of those that happened that made me realize, well, I should really go down to where Meher Baba's place is, which was really quite a distance away. Neem Karoli Baba was in the north of India. Meher Baba's place was in central India in Maharashtra state. And so I found my way down to Ahmednagar. And again, to make a very long story short, when I was in Ahmednagar, I went to Meher Baba's Samadhi, which is where this was 1972 when this happened. Meher Baba dropped his physical form in 1969, so he was no longer there. But many of his closest disciples were there. His disciples he called his mandali. It's a Sanskrit word that means circle. And so I was able to visit with his close mandali, and I was able to be in the presence of his tomb shrine called his Samadhi. And during that time, Meher Baba gave me that same inner awakening that I had experienced with Neem Karoli Baba. It was just almost precisely the same inner experience of the awakening of my heart at that extremely deep level. And the only difference I felt with Meher Baba was I felt that he was imprinting on me the message of that he is my master. So that is the story about how I came to realize that my primary connection was and is through Meher Baba. So that's in a nutshell.
Good little synopsis. Incidentally, I forgot to turn the live streaming on in the beginning, so those who just tuned in missed what I said earlier, which is that if you have a question during this interview, look beneath the video and you'll find a link to the Ask a Question page on badcap.com. Okay, so let's talk about who Meher Baba is. You just said he died in 1969, and he was born in 1800s, late 1800s?
1894.
Okay, so he lived pretty old, 74 years old or 76 years old or something. And he lived a remarkable life, which we'll be talking about some. What we want to cover in today's talk is a lot about him, who he was, what an avatar is, because he was said to be an avatar, what the role of a master might be in someone's life, and then various aspects of his teachings, comments he made about suffering, or something else called the new humanity. And he had a lot to say about how the soul evolves throughout the history of the universe, and a lot about the action, impression, desire cycle, samskaras impressions are called, and balancing out positive and negative impressions, and so on. So we hope to cover all this, but we want to start just by getting to know a little bit better about who Meher Baba was. And as I understand it, he was fairly remarkable as a young man, and also rather normal, liking sports and things like that, being a good student. But he was recognized by a couple of extraordinary souls or enlightened people as being special, as being someone special. And they both, I think one was this old lady, I think she kissed him on the forehead or something, and that sent him into a state. And then some other guy threw a rock at him and hit him square between the eyes, and that precipitated an awakening. The guy could have been a professional baseball pitcher if he had that kind of accuracy. But anyway, let's talk about his early life to begin with, and this sort of profound shift that he underwent, which made it obvious that he was not just an ordinary kid.
Sure. So, as you said, he was born in 1894 in Pune, India. It was called Pune back then. Now it's called Pune. It's a town. It's a large city right now. I think 2 or 3 million people in central India. And he was born in a Zoroastrian family. And for those who don't know Zoroastrianism, it's the sort of oldest major religion, recorded religion we had, headed by the prophet Zoroaster. So his parents were both Zoroastrian, and he did lead kind of, a normal childhood. He was a good kid. He was, a good student, good in sports, had leadership skills, all that, but nothing, there wasn't a lot about him that seemed overtly spiritual, though there were a few things, but that wasn't predominant. And then when he was 19 years old, he was going to college in Pune at Deccan College, and he used to ride his bicycle to college. And at the time in Pune, there lived a woman, as you said, Rick, named Hazrat Babajan, who was widely regarded as a saint. She was reputed to be over 100 years old, a Muslim woman. She lived outside under a neem tree. She lived there, day and night, 4 seasons out of the year, irregardless of the elements. And she was usually surrounded by countless numbers of people. She had huge numbers of devotees who believed that she was a spiritual being. And in India, that's pretty common in India, is that Indians can be very attuned to when there is a spiritual being and that they gravitate towards them. And so she had a large following like that was around her. And I don't know that she was particularly remote, but she wasn't just a usual person that sat and chatted with people. And one night, Meher Baba, his name, by the way, at the time was Merwan. His given name was Merwan Shariar Arani. So Merwan was cycling home from college one night, and he cycles by where Babajan was, and she calls him over to her. And I think that was quite unusual. I don't think she did that to many people, if any. And so he went and sat with her, and there was a kind of a magnetism between the two of them. And so he would start going back and sitting with her every night after school. And one night she turned to him, and as you said, she gave him a kiss on the forehead. And we would call that, from based on what Baba has given us about this. And again, I'm giving you, to the extent to which I can, I'll give you what Baba himself said, but there's a certain amount of, interpretation here. But we would call that his unveiling, that what she did is she actually unveiled him to his latent spiritual state of godhood, and by godhood, what I mean is infinite consciousness, which is what Baba says is the state of godhood. And so she unveiled that to him, and he went into that state, and he completely lost consciousness of the gross world. And, he went into a state where for 9 months, he didn't eat, he didn't sleep, and his eyes were wide open. And during that period of time, and his mother was beside herself with worry about him. His father actually, who was a very deep spiritual seeker, actually had a knowledge about what was going on, but sort of kept it to himself. So during those 9 months,
just a second. Now, I got to give lip service to the skeptics in the audience. So, sure. How can you not eat for 9 months? And did he literally not eat, or was he just like spoon fed, or on a liquid diet, or something like that?
Yeah, with yogis, as I understand it, Rick, can actually live on air,
breath. Yeah.
So you're talking about somebody in a very profoundly different state of consciousness. Right. That the functioning of their bodies can be completely on a different mode of being than what we associate with kind of.
Did he drink water?
That I can't tell you.
So as far as you know, according to the story, he didn't consume any nutrients for 9 months.
He no nutrients,
and he didn't sleep, or he had his eyes open the whole time.
His eyes wide open.
Yeah,
and he was not gross conscious.
Right.
So it's just he was completely unconscious. But
did they take him to doctors and stuff?
They did take him to doctors, and doctors couldn't figure it out. So he was beyond anything anyone could figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And so during that time, he wandered. And he wandered around to different places, and there are different stories about that. But the 4 of the wanderings we do actually know about. One of them was to a man named Narayan Maharaj, who lived in a town called Kedgaon. One was to a man named Tajuddin Baba, who lived in a city called Nagpur, which is in central India, these are people widely regarded as saints. And the third one was he wandered into a little village in central India called Shirdi. And I don't know if you've been to Shirdi, Rick, but at the time, it was just a little village.
I haven't, but Shirdi Sai Baba is very famous.
Right. Shirdi Sai Baba is probably the most famous, the most widely seen face you will see of a contemporary spiritual figure in India if you go there. And Shirdi Sai Baba lived there. And Shirdi Sai Baba was reputed to be, Muslim, Hindu, maybe both like that. But he was a fakir. Fakir means kind of he lived on alms and, he was penniless, basically. And he lived there. And, but he had a following. He was accepted as being a great master. And when Merwan approached him, and again, Merwan was just wandering. Merwan described this period that he was like an automaton possessing intuition. That's how he described it. But he wanders into this little village, and Shirdi Sai Baba is walking towards him, and Shirdi Sai Baba sees him, and he gets down on the ground and prostrates in front of him, and then he comes up and he goes.
Namaste.
I think it's called pranams.
Right.
And he addresses him as Parvardigar. And Parvardigar is a Sanskrit word, and it literally means the preserver and protector of the universe. And it's another word for the avatar. And so Sai Baba recognized him as such, and then directed him to his primary disciple, a man named Upasdi Maharaj, who was stationed in a temple just down the lane from where they were. And Upasdi Maharaj was another fakir living there. He's dressed in a gunny sack of all things. And so Merwan walks into the temple grounds, and Upasdi, as you said, picks up a stone, throws it at Merwan, hits him squarely, on the forehead, right where Babajan had kissed him. And that began the process of Merwan coming back into gross consciousness. And what that was the preparation, the beginning of the preparation for Merwan to perform his role as what is called avatar. And and I'll say a moment what avatar means, but for the next 7 years, Merwan spent off and on with Upasdi Maharaj, as Upasdi Maharaj helped him perfect the integration of his God consciousness with his gross man consciousness, so he could perform the role of avatar, which is called the God man, 100% God, 100% man. And then at the end of those 7 years, Upasdi Maharaj turned to Merwan. He addressed him as Adi Shakti, which means, you have all the power in the universe. And then he said, Merwan, you are the avatar, and I hand you the key. Key means responsibility. Now, an important thing to understand about all of this is the 5 people I've mentioned. Baba said we're all what are called perfect masters, or sadgurus, or the Sufi word for that is kutub. And they collectively, Baba says there are always 5 perfect masters in creation at all time, who are collectively responsible for the spiritual ongoingness and well-being and development of all in creation.
Creation meaning the whole universe.
The universe and the multiverse.
Okay, we'll get into that later.
Yes, but every being. And that periodically, this is going to be a way oversimplification, and I'll give it my interpretation of it. But they do sort of the maintenance function, and then the avatar comes and he does the strategic function of really accelerating, giving a spiritual push, Baba said, to creation to kind of get it moving at a much more accelerated pace. And so Baba said that the avatar the difference is the perfect masters perform the role of keeping things going and implementing kind of what needs to be done to keep things moving. But every 700 to 1400 years, the perfect masters will say, it's time that there is a major spiritual push, and they collectively precipitate the advent of the avatar. They arrange the circumstances of the avatar's birth. And then when the time is right, in this case, it was when Merwan sat with Babajan, then the avatar is unveiled as to what their true state is. So they don't actually go through a spiritual development process. What their process is simply unveiling. And it's akin to what happens every time the avatar comes. And the one that I think we all know probably the best in our culture is the unveiling that took place of Jesus by John the Baptist when he met John the Baptist. But according to Baba, it happens with every avatar. Every form of the avatar happened with the Buddha, Rama, Krishna, Zoroaster, and most recently Muhammad. So that's the story about how Baba became conscious of his role as the avatar. And then that was about 1921 when he began actually performing what he called his universal work, which is to bring about the spiritual transformation of consciousness within creation.
Okay, so a lot of people use the word avatar. I've interviewed a couple of people who claim to be avatars, and there are many other people whose followers claim that they are avatar, that the teacher is an avatar. But according to Baba, he would probably say, no, these people aren't really avatars because there's only X number of them, or he's the only one, he was saying, and that they're not as common as we would be led to believe if you listen to all the people who say they're avatars. I guess you would agree with that?
Yeah, I think so, Rick. I mean, I think, the word avatars, it's just taken on such a broad meaning now. Yeah. This is the person, this is the avatar of this thing or that. And if you read Autobiography of a Yogi, which I assume, I'm sure you've read, he talks about there's the avatar there's the avatar of this quality or that quality. And I think I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with that. The word avatar is a Sanskrit word. It literally means descent, and sometimes is interpreted as descent into darkness. But the way that Baba uses it is very specific. It was very interesting when Paramahansa Ramakrishna, who was the great perfect master from Calcutta, was on and he was Baba said he was a perfect master and of his time. And of course, his great disciple was Vivekananda. And Vivekananda was, he was a very kind of rational, intellectual kind of person. And so he was, he had his skeptical side too. And he would press Ramakrishna about who he was. And when Ramakrishna was on his deathbed, he died of throat cancer, but he was on his deathbed. And it's said that Vivekananda went to him and said, so Ramakrishna, really, who are you? Really, who are you? And Ramakrishna said, I am the avatar, but not in the Vedantic sense. And that's the difference here, is that there's a very particular meaning within the Vedantic world, and you're much more familiar with that than I am, Rick, so I can't quote Vedantic scripture, but that was what Ramakrishna was reputed to have said. And the meaning that I believe Ramakrishna meant by that, and the one that Baba talks about, and he's very explicit about this, is he says that there is this periodic reoccurrence on earth of God that comes and takes a human form as God and lives the life of what's called the God-man, which is the life of somebody, and they do not evolve through a spiritual development process themselves. They come in as that, and they come in with that particular role. A perfect master, by contrast, is a being who has been through an entire developmental process from the very beginning of their experiencing creation through the evolution, and we can go into this too, of consciousness through human incarnations, and then through the process that Meher Baba calls the involution of consciousness through 6 different planes beyond the gross physical plane into a state in the oversoul of identity where they do experience God consciousness. And their consciousness is no different from anyone who's in that God state, whether it's the avatar or what's called a majub, which is another God realized being. They all share the same consciousness. They have different roles. And in the case of the avatar, as opposed to an avatar of the avatar, that they have a different derivation of how they got to where they are.
Okay. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, I was a student of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he was emphatic that he wasn't an avatar and his teacher wasn't an avatar, but he said what an avatar is like you said, God takes human form, and in order to not just randomly, but at a specific time when something needs to be accomplished that humans wouldn't be able to accomplish. And plays like Krishna came at a certain time in the Mahabharata war and all that. And, the situation is such that it needs some kind of divine intervention in order for some change or something to be facilitated. So, and this thing about 56 in the whole universe, I'm kind of a fan of astronomy. I mean, that to me would mean that there's like one perfect master for every, I don't know, a couple 100 billion galaxies, which, and there are, quintillions of stars in a couple 100 billion galaxies. So I don't know. I'm deeply skeptical about that possibility, because it seems to me, and also Baba said that only on Earth can people evolve or reach God or something like that, that the spiritual evolution doesn't happen anywhere else in the universe. That seems so geocentric to me. I mean, that it kind of sounds like the Catholic Church, in Galileo's time, who got real upset if the suggestion that the Earth wasn't the center of everything. So, I mean, you have faith in Baba, and I don't mean to be challenging of your faith, but Baba himself at one point, allowed something to be published, which was, kind of factually incorrect. So he seems to have admitted to being capable of making statements that conflicted with scientific knowledge, or at least as it evolves. And he said something about how most of the UFOs that come to visit Earth are from other planets in our solar system, which are inhabited, and there are more planets in our solar system than science is aware of. And that hasn't panned out, and nor has the idea of life on other planets in our solar system panned out. So I'm just, I've been around the block myself for many decades, and I have an attitude of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, but taking everything with a grain of salt, and proportions vary. There might be something which I'm 99% sure of, but who knows? Maybe it's wrong. I'm 99% sure the Earth is not flat, although there are people who believe it is. But ultimately, I feel like God is omnipresent in all creation, and therefore evolution is omnipresent in all creation. And Baba does get into that, and we can talk about that, the various stages of, stone, metal, etc., as souls evolve. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant. Do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, a few things you said, Rick, that are worthy responding to. But again, I mean, I think one thing to say about Baba is that there's certain enigmas associated with Baba, and so it's not hard to find certain contradictions or inconsistencies in Baba in his life, and one has to really wrestle with those with Baba. But I will say this: when you say he allowed this thing to be published, I mean, it was true that Baba could allow other things to be published that that weren't necessarily things that were of his authorship or necessarily things that he was specifically endorsing, but he simply allowed them to be published.
It was attributed to him, but maybe it wasn't him. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I think that there are instances where Baba seemed to say that certain things would happen at a certain time, and there was no evidence of them actually happening.
Right.
That's also true. It's also true that there are many things Baba said in the very early 1920s, and that seemed preposterous at the time, like multiverses. Who thought about multiverses back then? And now that's sort of mainstream thinking within much of the scientific community, is that there is more than one universe here.
Sure.
So, and there's many things like that as well. So I don't think you can be. I don't think it's possible to be one-dimensional about it. But it's also true, and I think we're going to get into talking about Baba's silence also at some point in time, that there were many times that Baba said he would break his silence, and there was no apparent event associated with the breaking of his silence.
Yeah.
And so again, these are the kinds of anomalies that crop up that I know I have my own interpretations of those kinds of things, but I certainly acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah. So I guess the question is an avatar or a perfect master expected to be, by definition, infallible in all circumstances?
Yes.
Yes, you say. And
infinite knowledge.
Infinite knowledge. So Einstein was a contemporary of Baba, although Einstein was a bit older. But would Einstein and Baba have been able to sit down and discuss, Einstein's theories of relativity in the terminology that Einstein was capable of, would Baba, having infinite knowledge, have been able to understand the mathematics involved and discuss that as a peer of Einstein, or infinite capabilities? Also, you might say. I mean, could Andres Segovia have handed Baba a guitar and he could have played it like Segovia did? Obviously, if you're in a human body, it's going to have its limitations, both in terms of what it can do and even what it can know.
Baba said he was 100% God and 100% man. And he was really the most human of people. He was very human. He lived a life, yes, his godhood gave him infinite bliss, infinite knowledge, and infinite power. But he said he did not always make use of those things in order to fulfill his function as the avatar. So he didn't rely on, for example, on his infinite bliss to protect him from suffering. And his whole life was suffering. Baba said the avatar comes to take on suffering. And likewise with knowledge, it's interesting, Baba, when Baba would meet people, for example, he could say to them things like, hey, what's your name, Rick? Your name's Rick Archer. Tell me something about where do you live, Rick? What do you do for a living? Do you have any children? Do you have any pets? Like that. He could say all those things as if he didn't know any of those things. But with just one moment, he could, in fact, show he knew not only all of that, but he knew all about, your past, your future, all of this stuff. He could do that in a moment. He could draw upon that. But generally, he didn't do that. He was very natural with people and very warm, very loving, very friendly with people like that, and, put people at ease like that. But again, there were so many instances where he revealed that, he knew exactly what was going on, and he knew exactly not just what was going on now, but what would be going on, many years in the future, and was able to demonstrate that. But for the most part, it was very rare that he actually did that with people. It was much more common for him to act just normal. Just natural.
I mean, Baba told the story of a master who was a perfect master or something, and some yogi showed off by walking across a river and the master paid an ana, which is a small amount of funds to take to just hire a ferry to take him across. And so, I mean, I think that, in other words, he could have walked us on the water, presumably, if this yogi could, but he wasn't into doing cheap tricks. And I've heard that said, supposedly, of enlightened people of a certain stature, that they could know anything, although only one thing at a time, because it's not given to a fleshly nervous system to have complete omniscience. In other words, if Baba were alive now in his physical body and he were living in India, he wouldn't be following our conversation, or he wouldn't know my social security number or whatever. But so in other words, not actual physical omniscience. You need a celestial nervous system for that, but that one could, if it were really worth knowing, know anything by putting your attention there, if there was some reason to know my social security number. But obviously he's not going to waste his time getting into the minutiae of things like that. I don't know.
I mean, I think, what you're saying is probably true, may well be true for people on advanced planes of consciousness. Because people on advanced planes of consciousness, depending on the plane, according to Baba, have those kinds of capacities and can exercise them maybe selectively, as you suggest. I mean, Baba said, as the avatar or a perfect master, they can know everything that's going on at any one time. Everything, if that's what they choose to do, and where they put their attention. I know, there would be these major, what are called darshan programs. Darshan is again another word that means sight, but they're very common with spiritual personages, especially in places like India, where it is said just to be in the presence of a God-realized being or advanced being like Meher Baba for 1 second, Kabir said, it's worth more than 100 years of sincere prayer. Just 1 second. And that's something that people in India, many of them really understand that. And so they seek out these opportunities for darshan. So you hear these stories, and there's so many stories about Baba. I mean, of stories of people's experiences with Baba, being like in a darshan program where there's thousands of people there. And every person there that you talk to has a different story about extremely profound experience they had of Baba and Baba's connection with them in that program of sitting with him for a few hours and just experiencing Baba's presence, number one, but also experiencing Baba's omniscience in terms of his knowingness and connecting with them personally at that time. And that's with thousands of people being there at the same time. So I don't think it's possible to individualize or particularize or limit what the possibilities are of a being such as Meher Baba and his ability to be able to make and sustain contact with innumerable, any number of beings at a time, in a way, at any one point in time. So I think that would be my response to you.
Of course, people's subjective assumptions or experience are one thing, and then something that's objectively verifiable is another thing. But we don't need to go there. Here's a thing that I thought was worth noting down about what a perfect master is. And again, we're distinguishing between a perfect master and an avatar. But one, they recognize their self as the self of all beings. Standard line from the Bhagavad Gita. Two, they experience infinite bliss, but also infinite suffering. But the infinite bliss overshadows the suffering. And three, they are infinitely adaptable. They can adapt themselves to relate to anybody, rich or poor, wiser or ignorant, whatever. Baba said, I am in all and one with all. That is why I can adapt myself to all kinds of people and meet them where they are, which, these are not unique words. They're in all the scriptures, but it's nice when you meet somebody who seems to have those characteristics. But why infinite suffering? Why would someone like Baba or a perfect master experience infinite suffering along with infinite bliss?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it gets to the heart of who is the avatar and why does the avatar come? So Baba said the avatar does not come to take on the karma of the world. That's not his role. He said that what happens over time, that humanity inherits karma. Like we all know, I think probably everybody listening to this podcast has some understanding about what karma is. That karma is the law of cause and effect. It says any action you take you're going to have to experience the opposite reaction in order to balance it out, because that's the means by which consciousness evolves. So Bob said that over time, humanity, and it's the way it functions, it creates a certain amount of karma for itself. And that karma can be very intense. Genocides, wars, slavery, oppression, greed, the outcome of greed and all of these kinds of things that happen both at an individual level, they also happen at a collective level. So over time, humanity inherits an enormous amount of karma. Now, when the avatar comes, the purpose of the avatar's coming is to give a spiritual push. Well, to give a spiritual push, he doesn't take on that karma. He doesn't sort of just get rid of the karma, because the karma is there. It has to, the karma is there for a purpose. It's not just to punish. It's not to punish people. It's to help people learn from it. It's to help people grow from it. So the avatar comes to help humanity deal with the karma that they've inherited. Well, the karma that you've inherited, that it's associated with suffering, that in order to pay back, what humanity did through enslaving African Americans, or through the genocide of Native American populations, or through the Holocaust in Germany, or any of those kinds of things, there's an enormous price to be paid in terms of karmic debt on that. And Baba said that if humanity had to bear all of the suffering associated with that on their own, that it would crush humanity. And so the avatar comes to take on and help shoulder a certain portion of that suffering so that humanity can actually experience enough of the suffering that it has actually earned over its time. So it can experience that, work through it, and then through the working through of that suffering, it can then evolve in consciousness. And that is what Baba called his universal work. Baba's universal work, he said, was to effect a fundamental change in the nature of consciousness within creation and certainly within humanity. And Baba said, he said, the entire reason the avatar comes is to do his universal work. And he said he's doing that universal work all the time. He's continually preoccupied with his universal work. And he says he's doing that universal work on all levels and all planes of consciousness simultaneously. And clearly that means we can't see the work. That, as you said, you have to, maybe it's an article of faith from your point of view, where you sort of say, okay, well, Baba said it. He said he's doing all this work on all these different planes of consciousness at the same time. And Baba said that the impact of his universal work would be to shift consciousness from the level of operating at the level of reason to operating at the level of intuition. And he said that would be the outcome and the impact of his universal work. Well, we may not be able to see the work. There are certain things that we can talk about that we can see with Baba's work, and I'm happy to, I can give you some examples of that. But I think it's fair to say that we are seeing this shift in consciousness that's starting to occur on a very large scale. Now, it may not have reached the level of the entire swath of humanity, but it is a very wide scale that we're now seeing that more and more people seem to be operating on that level of intuition, kind of tuning into their hearts and learning to sort of find kind of sources of wisdom and guidance from their hearts as sources of guidance for them in their own lives. And again, is that a function of Meher Baba's universal work? That's, that would be a question for somebody to answer on their own.
And we're going to be talking a little bit later about the sort of shifting of the age to, I guess he called it the new humanity or something. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Just a little bit of a random question here. How come avatars are always male, according to Meher Baba?
Yeah, I don't have I don't know that I can give you a source on that one, Rick. It seems to be, Baba said, when the avatar comes, it's always a male. Right. Now, perfect masters can be male or female, just to say. So it's not, but there's something about the avatar always, Baba said, it always takes a male form. It's also true that every time the avatar comes, there is what I would term, I don't think that this is quite the term Baba used, so I'm gonna say it for myself, a kind of a spiritual counterpart. And so when Radha came, when Krishna came, he had Radha. When Ram came, he had Sita. And when Jesus came, he had Mary. And then when Meher Baba came, there was a woman who came, who was his closest disciple, his most beloved, was a woman named Mera. And Mera, Baba said, was his very breath. He said he could not live without her. And just to say, there was never anything carnal about that relationship. Baba said for him, sex didn't exist. And so there was never anything like that took place with Baba. But Mera, Baba said, was the purest soul in the universe. And he said every time he comes, I heard this through Meher Baba's secretary, a man named Adi Kairani, that he had heard that Baba had said that every time he comes as avatar, Mera comes with him. So there is that male-female relationship that is always there when the avatar comes.
Okay. Obviously, any of these points that we're covering, we could talk another half an hour about if we wanted to, but we're kind of skimming along because I want to cover a lot of territory. And if people have particular questions about anything talking about, they can send them in and we can go a little bit into more detail. There was something called the new life that you wanted to make sure that we talked about. So I want to throw that in before we get too far.
Sure. So Meher Baba, So let me talk a little bit about Baba's mandali and the training of his mandali, because I think it's really important. You know, when Baba began to function as the avatar, that was not around 1921, 22, and one of the first things he did was to start to gather his close circle of disciples that he called his mandali. And Baba said every time the avatar comes, the avatar always has an inner circle of 12 disciples. Of course, we know that from Christianity. We know about those 12, but he said there are actually 10 concentric circles of 120 mandali that surround the avatar, plus the 2 additional women who make up the circles of the avatar. And when the avatar comes, he uses these mandali as his vehicles for helping perform his universal work. And he does that. Initially, he has to train them to do that. And Baba's training of his mandali was very intense. It was very rigorous, and he was training them in a life of love and obedience and surrender. That was the nature of the life. And it was a life that was extremely demanding on them. Baba was, he lived a very austere life in many ways. He led a life of there seemed to be almost constant motion with Baba. And there was also things like Baba would often change his plans. He would say he was going to do one thing, and then he'd change his mind and do something else. And there was this constant change that required constant flexibility and readaptability to what Baba was doing. And just parenthetically, I read an interview with Aurobindo once, Sri Aurobindo, the great saint from Pondicherry. And Aurobindo was being asked about Meher Baba at one time, what he was. And Aurobindo said something like, well, you can tell he's a great yogi because he's always changing his plans. And he says, that's what great yogis do.
Yeah,
so,
I've seen a few of those.
yeah. So that was Baba's way, and the training of his disciples was rigorous for the Eastern mandali, and then he went west in 1931 and began gathering his close Western mandali, who then, as I said earlier, he brought a number of them back to India for training, and he trained them, and so that went on for a while. And then there was another period, which we'll get to when we talk about Baba's work with the masts. But in 1949, Meher Baba decided to do on this, quite suddenly, as far as the mandali were concerned, he entered into a new phase of his activities. And by the way, Baba's life is so extraordinarily rich that there are volumes and volumes of biographies and experiences people have written about him. There's a 20-volume biography of his life, and that only begins, that there's plenty that's not in there. So it's very rich. But in 1949, Meher Baba began what he called the new life. And the new life was, I think, for many people, a very enigmatic period in Baba's life, where Baba essentially sold off or gave away everything that was in his possession at that time. That meant property, and meant, cooking vessels, beds, so everything that had accumulated over that time. And he embarked on a period that he said would be a period of hopelessness and helplessness. And it was a period where Baba seemed to take on, up to that time, Baba had been in the role of the master. And he had been exacting the kind of obedience and the kind of doing the kind of training and the kind of activities associated with the master. During that time, he took on the role of a spiritual companion. And he seemed to live a life, with a very select group of companions, that there were 4 women and there were 20-some men amongst his mandali who left everything behind and spent a period that was to be an indefinite period of time wandering around India and just living a life basically of begging and living in the elements and just living completely in the present moment. And he called it a life of hopelessness and helplessness, meaning it was a life of complete dependence on God and life in living in the present moment is what it was. And one of the demands of that life, and one of the things that I think some people found extremely challenging, in fact, one of the conditions that Baba gave for people that would join him on the new life, and he gave people a choice about whether they would do it, was they had to maintain 100% cheerfulness in spite of everything that was going on. And there was a lot of stuff that went on. They were sleeping out in the open in northern India in the winter months, which was in freezing rain like that, with barely any cover, if any cover at all, and sometimes going without food for long periods of time like that, because they were living just on the beneficence of whoever would give them, what's called bhiksha, donations, charitable donations. So that was the life that Baba lived. And there's a question mark, and it was a very intense life, and it went on for 2 years, and it culminated in a period that Baba called Mananash. And Mananash literally means the annihilation of the mind. So if you're at all familiar with the Sufis, the Sufis talk about the spiritual path as a series of annihilations. They call them fanas. And the annihilation of the mind is called the fana phala, the final annihilation. It's the annihilation of the mind, of when the mind finally is gone and one is propelled then into the godhood. And Baba went through this process of the new life, and it culminated in this period called Mananash that Baba went through over the period between October 1951 and February 1952 in India. So he did that. And again, there's so much to be said about this, Rick. I mean, there are volumes and volumes written about the new life. It's so hard to encapsulate it here. But the thing I'd want to say about it is that the nature of Baba's work was, I think, can be seen as archetypal in many ways. And I don't want to say that's the only nature of Baba's work. I think Baba's work is so multifaceted that you can't sort of say it is this versus that. But it does seem like at least one dimension of it was archetypal. And by archetypal, what I mean is, Meher Baba said he's God. He said, if he's God, he said, I am the higher self in every single being. Every single being can find me within them, within their hearts. If they open themselves and look for me, you will find me there. That was essentially what Meher Baba said, in not so many words. And so everything Baba did, if you accept that Baba is everyone in their higher self, then everything Baba did in his human form was as if everyone in creation was getting the benefit of, as if they had done that themselves. And so if Meher Baba lives the life of a perfect spiritual seeker, which is essentially what he did during the new life, it is as if he has dug a channel inside the heart of each individual, that as each of us are so prompted and so ready to do so, to start to enter the process of trying to lead that kind of life of spiritual aspiration and so on. Just the fact that he lived the new life has helped create the channel within each one of us to make it much easier for us to follow that path. And that's and same with Mananash, is that when we're ready and we get to the point where we've actually gotten to the point where we're ready to actually have that final annihilation, he's made it much easier to enter into that process of final annihilation. And that is essentially what Meher Baba said his role was. He said, I came as the avatar in order to bring about, he said, I didn't come as a teacher. The most fundamental thing Baba said about himself, and these words are engraved on this marble slab that covers his body and his tomb shrine in India, it says, I have come not to teach, but to awaken. He says, all the teachings are out there. He said, and it's true, Baba gave lots of great teachings. It's not that he didn't teach, but the emphasis always with Baba was the awakening of the heart, which he said, that is what will actually bring about the transformation of people, not the absorption of a lot of intellectual information about these things. So from that point of view, that the work that Baba did on the new life seemed to be about helping to set the pattern for anyone who was so prompted. And Baba said the avatar advent itself would create the conditions for people to be prompted to pursue the inner spiritual life, that it would make it much easier for them to enter into and proceed along that life. So yeah. That's a synopsis.
If you have a garden and you dig it up every year to plant things, you notice that the dirt is a lot easier to dig up where it's been dug before than it would be in some place where no digging has ever taken place. So, I think that all the great spiritual teachers, whatever their status, avatar or master or whatever, have been sort of digging up the ground, so to speak, which makes it easier for us to dig. Someone like the Buddha or whatever, maybe the Buddha had to pierce through a much more impermeable membrane to reach enlightenment, but having pierced it, and many others having now pierced it, it's thinner, more diaphanous, easier to pierce. And so a lot of people are having awakenings, which wouldn't have been possible 2,000 years ago, which is why this show is called Buddha at the Gas Pump. And when Baba says, I am God, I mean, you could say the same thing, because you're not your physical body. You're not your mental, you're not your subtle body. You're not your mental body. You're not any of the 5 sheaths, depending on the model we want to use. When you get right down to it, we are Brahman. We are pure consciousness. We are, infinite, all-pervading intelligence. So we're all God. In fact, God alone is, right? I mean, what else is there other than God? But I guess we're saying here, Baba is someone who never, didn't come in as a ignorant person that had to evolve up to the realization of being God. Although even there, with him and with other avatars such as Rama, they didn't get it when they were little kids. It eventually dawned upon them, but their soul didn't evolve to the status. It's God, divine intelligence somehow assumed a physical body without having to go through an evolutionary trajectory, and then took on the role they were meant to play.
Well, you're completely right. And Baba said, I'm the avatar. He said, but each of you are avatar. He said,
exactly.
We're all avatar. He said, the only difference is I'm aware. I know that I'm God.
Right.
He said,
you don't.
That's not true. You don't. But I'm here to help you. I am here to help you know your real self. I'm here to help you to realize who you really are. And that's his role. So, but Baba said every individual is destined for Godhood. Sooner
or later. And I'm still bugged about this notion that only on Earth is this possible, because there are far more souls in the universe than could ever fit on Earth. And so I still don't get that, but I don't think we're going to resolve it through discussion. But, the Earth is a speck in a vast, there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the world. And that's a lot of stars. So to think that we on this little speck that happens to be orbiting one particular grain of sand are the be all and end all just doesn't jibe with my orientation, but whatever. Here's an interesting point of discussion, perhaps. So if the master is alive, like let's say one of Baba's contemporaries, and you're working with the master, then the master would have to earn your trust before winning your obedience. You're not just going to immediately meet the guy and do whatever he says. At least most people aren't. You have to sort of test him, check him out, see how he performs, see if you get the kind of results you hope as you interact with him. Now, if the master is not alive, I've heard you or someone else mention intuiting Baba's wishes. And how do you know that you're genuinely intuiting Baba's wishes or God's wishes or whatever, and obeying them, and not just your own whims? Because I've run into all kinds of people whose intuition tells them that they should, sell the house and invest in Bitcoin or something, whatever, just different things. And how do you discern genuine, profound spiritual intuition, even some kind of divine input, from personal human whims?
Rick, I love this question. I've written articles about this and given talks about it. It's been a central focus of my own development personally is exploring that very question. Baba did say that we were entering into an age of intuition. And so the question, I think there is a real question like, well, what is intuition? How does one develop it? And how does one learn how to rely on it? One of the one of the things Baba said, let me go back a step, and, I'm going to sort of come at this from a slightly different angle than you may want to come at it later on about Baba's silence. Baba said, I am, if you ask me why I'm silent, you've not understood my silence. He said, I'm always speaking. He said,
we actually even we mentioned his silence kind of in passing, but did you actually say what happened? Like in 1925, he just stopped talking, right? And he didn't talk for the rest of his life. Have we explained that to people?
Okay, so let me say that, and then I'll kind of segue into the intuition question if you'd like. So in 1925, Baba indicated to the Mandali that he was going to stop speaking for a period of time, and the Mandali didn't believe it, by the way. The Mandali thought, this is preposterous. This guy loves talking. He loves singing. He's just, he won't last a week, kind of thing.
Like my friend said when I learned to meditate in 1968, oh yeah, we'll see what you're doing 2 weeks from now.
Right. But, Baba fooled them all, and he started a silence, and he didn't break it. And, a week turned into a month, turned into a year, and it kept going. And, sometimes Baba would say, I'm going to break my silence on such and such a day. And then there's no indication that he ever broke it. So, and I want to, Rick, I'm going to say a little bit about Baba's silence, if you don't mind.
No, yeah, please. And while you're at it, explain how he actually wrote all these books. He had this letterboard and everything. I have a follow-up question once you explain that.
Yeah. So when he began his silence, I mean, he did a few things before he started using an alphabet board, but at some point he started using a little board, I guess a cardboard or, plywood or something that had letters of the alphabet on it.
And he spoke English, right?
Sorry?
Did he speak English? He did.
He spoke English, Gujarati, Hindi.
And of course, being omniscient, he spoke every language in the universe.
There was that. There was that. Yeah, I think he spoke Urdu actually as well. As people in Maharashtra do, just to say. I mean, Marathi and spoke Marathi. That's one of the most widely spoken languages in the world. But he used this board, pointing to letters of the alphabet, and he would have to have somebody read the board. One of his mandali. He was so fast on it that you had to be really skilled to be able to do that. So it was only certain mandali were able to do that. But if you look at Baba's teachings, the books that he gave, and there are not that many of them, but the books he gave out that have been published, I think there may be 10 or 12 of major books that have been, and then a few others. They were all done on the alphabet board. They were all done by pointing these letters and having them read out and then taking down, and then people would take what he gave and they shape them into paragraphs and English,
so it got edited a bit, because I was wondering, like, the books, if you read them, I've read Discourses now, and I've read some of God Speaks, and they're long, coherent, sentences and paragraphs. And I'm wondering how that actually came to be. I mean, did he actually remember where he was going with it as he pointed around to the letters, or did he periodically have to stop and say, okay, now read me what you got, and then I'll take it from there?
Well, I wasn't there when he did it, but I think, as he was doing it, he didn't need anybody to restate it, because people were reading it out as he went. So he knew what they were getting.
I see. They were saying it aloud. Okay.
So he was saying it aloud. So he could do that. And what he would generally do, as I understand it, is he'd give people points, and he'd say, okay, these are the points to cover in the discourse. Now thread them together in some kind of coherent manner that will actually be communicable to the audience. And then somebody would do that. And then on most of his books, he would have that read back to him, and then he would make corrections from that point in time. So that was generally how he did those. I think there were exceptions to it here and there, but I think that was the general pattern by which he did it, Rick. So he kept the silence. He would say he would break it a certain time. There was no indication of it, and the Mandali got used to it. They knew. Well, Baba says he's going to break his silence on such and such a time. They knew that there wasn't going to be any indication of it. But Baba would say things about the breaking of silence that began to be very profound. And he said, when I break my silence, the whole world will feel and receive of it. And I will only speak one word, and that word will go directly to the heart of man from God. And that word itself will bring about a fundamental change in the consciousness of each individual who receives of it. And he said the breaking of silence was actually going to bring about what he called his manifestation, which is where he would actually manifest the impact of his avataric advent. So the breaking of silence was fundamental to the universal work. Now, just to say a few words about that, Rick, because I've given a lot of thought to this one, as many people have, because Baba's silence has got to be seen as one of the most salient features of his avatarhood on a physical level. I mean, he's known as, people call him the silent master.
Sure.
And so,
I mean, that's all I knew about him. Okay, he was silent, and they said he was an avatar.
Yeah.
That's all you hear initially.
But he wasn't remote.
Right, he was very involved.
He engaged with people all the time. And I know countless numbers of people who were with him physically, and many of them say they weren't even aware he was silent, because the way he would communicate would go directly into their heart. So, it was only afterward, when they walked out of the room, they said, oh my God, he wasn't even talking. That was one of the Mandali who was speaking for him. So his silence was, the experience of being in Baba's presence was an experience of a very awakened heart that Baba could then speak to directly like that. So, but I think there are three different, I'm not going to say what the meaning is of Baba's silence, but I think there are three different ways of looking at it. Some people would say, and they're Mandali who would say that Baba broke his silence in each individual who he awakened, just like he awakened me to come to him, or your friend who he awakened in Australia. He awakens each one of us individually, and that is his breaking his silence in each of our hearts. That's one version. So when Baba said he's going to break his silence on such and such a day, maybe there were some mass of people that he awakened that particular day. That's one possibility.
Or it could be the yogi's always changing his mind kind of a thing, where he would say something and then not do it, just to sort of pull the rug out from under people.
Exactly, and to test and to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff kind of thing. But another possibility, and this is something that also many people believe, and I think there's basis for it, is that there will come a time at some point when Baba does break his silence. And Baba did say the breaking of his silence would coincide with this massive change that would occur. And he said it would be a sudden change. And he said, it's a change that would bring about a massive level of, he said 3/4 of the world would be destroyed when he broke his silence.
I wanted to ask you about that. So are you saying that he said that the world population, that what would be about 6 billion people will die and we'll have 2 billion left? Is that what that means? So
when Mayor Baba said that, he said that in 1956, 57, right, in a statement that's called his final declaration, which is his statement about what's to come. And he said that when he breaks the silence, 3/4 of the world would be destroyed. It caused a lot of upset at the time. And so later on, Baba gave what he called his clarification of his final declaration. There were a number of things that Baba covered in the final declaration, of which that was one of them. And for each of the points that he made, he clarified which statements were made in our language, meaning the language that,
literal,
that we can understand. This says, oh, that makes sense. This is what's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Then there were statements that he said were made in his language alone. In other words, things that it sounds like we could understand them, but actually I think you'd only understand them in retrospect. I don't think you'd understand them prospectively.
So in other words, it might be a symbolic sort of thing where we're not talking about literal destruction, but some kind of a transformation, and maybe 3/4 of our current, commercial enterprises will no longer exist because they don't belong to in a more enlightened world or something like that.
Right. And I'll give you another version of that in a moment. But the third category was things that were said in his language and our language simultaneously. The statement about 3/4 of the world being destroyed, he said, was in his language alone. So it doesn't sound like 6 billion people being gone.
Mhm.
That I have heard. I mean, one of the Mandali, who's very, very close with Baba, one of his closest male Mandali, a man named Bal Kalchuri, he suggested that the 3/4 of the world meant 3/4 of what are called unnatural sanskaras, or impressions of the mind, would be destroyed. And we can get into sanskaras later on. I think that's on a list of some of your questions, Rick.
Yeah.
But but the sanskaras has to do with the tendencies of the mind to identify themselves as being other than God. And so he said that, another way of understanding the 3/4 of the world would be destroyed is 3/4 of those impressions would be gone. So
yeah, there's something just to recall. There's something in the Upanishads or someplace about how, I mean, it's sort of not literal, but somehow that the world or that life is 3/4 absolute and 1/4 relative, or something like that, and that for someone living in a state of enlightenment, that's their ratio. They're predominantly, there's no world, nothing's ever happened, and that's their reality. But then more superficially, there's the world of activities and things happening. So who knows? He could have been alluding to that notion.
Well, it seems like what Baba said might be kind of consistent with that, because it wasn't he said that everybody's going to become God realized. I think what he was saying was that there's going to be this huge shift in consciousness, that people can be much more God conscious,
right,
and much less connected to the gross realm. In fact, Bal Kachuri said that Baba had said to him in this is a whole other topic. Let me pull back from that one. I'll get to that one later on if we want to, but it has to do with what that actually means when Baba says that he would break his silence, and that it would make it a much easier access into the planes of consciousness, into the involution planes of consciousness.
Yeah.
As another way of understanding that. And you can see that today. I mean, isn't that what we see with all of the tremendous growth? And, the first planes of consciousness are the planes of energy. Those are the subtle planes of consciousness. But what do we see in the world today? Focus on energy healing, people talking about energy, people focused on kind of moving into these sort of more subtle realms.
Sure.
So it does seem like, whether you attribute it to Meher Baba or not, it does seem like that is the shift we're starting to see at the awakening, within the awakening subculture in particular. So
yeah, I mean, I've talked to people who just had profound awakenings while tying their shoelaces, and they weren't even interested in spiritual awakenings. And all of a sudden, they're experiencing the kind of thing that yogis sat in a cave for 20 years to experience.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's something in the air these days.
Baba said that the avatar period is like the springtide of creation. And he said these qualities of energy and awareness are available during the avatar periods, like they're not normally available. Right. And all of a sudden people can access them.
So make hay while the sun shines.
Yeah.
This thing, you probably read this in the notes I sent you, but did Baba really say that there will be mass landings of spaceships that will take people up and help them and then return them to Earth in a healthier state? Or is that something that was misquoted to him? It was something I came across in all my research that I did. Okay, so who knows? So I took you off the track because you wanted to talk about discerning actual divine guidance from individual whims.
So and the reason why I talk about the silence, because I'm going back to Baba's archetypal work, because another way of looking at Baba's silence, again, is that it's an archetypal act, that Baba keeping silence for 40. The reason why people keep silence at a spiritual level, as I understand it, is in order to learn to quiet the mind, so that one can reach into these deeper levels. So if the avatar is doing all of these works, and he's doing them on behalf of all of us in creation, it's like we're all getting the benefit as if we have been through that kind of quieting of our minds. So depending on our own levels of receptivity, we're then able to then access those deeper recesses of our beings as a result of that. So that is what intuition is. It's reaching into those deeper layers. Because Baba said, I'm never silent. is that the voice that's heard deep within the soul is my voice. It's the voice of intuition, of inspiration and guidance. So the question then becomes, okay, Baba has, let's assume Baba has opened up that channel, and Baba's dug that channel for us, and we can now move into that channel. Or if you don't believe it's Baba, leave that aside. But let's say that that's the path we're on to try to develop, to refine that capacity within ourselves to be able to access those parts of our deeper being. Then we are faced with, it's not like it's all there and it's all crystal clear and all that. It still is a process of learning how to work with that capacity in ourselves. And the Sufis, I spent quite a few years studying Sufi healing from a Sufi perspective. So I got quite a bit of exposure to it. And one of the concepts within Sufi healing is within the Sufi healing work that I did, was that there are 4 different layers of the heart. And the first layer and the most superficial layer is what they call the nafs. Actually, some Sufis would say every layer is the nafs, but in this way of looking at the
How
nafs,
do you spell nafs?
N-A-F-S,
Okay.
or it's actually nafs.
That's how
It's
you
usually
pronounce
pronounced nafs. It's actually, I think the Arabic is nafs. And it has to do with the kind of the chatter of the mind. It's all the things the mind is constantly, it's like the monkey mind stuff. The mind is constantly saying, I like this, I don't like that, this is a good person, this is bad, I don't like this person, whatever it is. But it's all of that stuff that goes on in the mind. That's layer number 1. Layer number 2 is the layer of emotions that are associated with the first layer of the mind. So it's all the layers of, pain, pleasure, disgust, happiness, like that. But it's all stuff that's triggered and associated with, I like this person, so I feel pleasure. I feel safe with this person, so I have a feeling of kind of relaxation. I feel angry at this person, so I have this, experience of anger or whatever. I don't like this person, I feel angry. That's all second layer of the mind, like stuff. The third layer of the mind is what, according to this model, and it's called the heart. It's actually the heart itself. And it's very interesting because the third layer is where the heart starts to turn away from the activity of the mind and the associated emotions of the mind to start to actually tune into the deeper parts of self, the higher parts of self, the one might associate with the divine parts of self. And it's very interesting that the Arabic word for heart, and I can't remember what it is exactly right now, but the meaning of it is that which turns. So at that level, the heart is in fact turning toward God. And that's where you start to actually have access to what we call intuition. And the fourth layer of the heart is called the secret. And I can't really speak a whole lot about that, but I think it's where, rather than sort of turning, you're now kind of fully established in that, in that realm of hearing the voice of the divine, or hearing the voice of the higher self, or whatever, or God, or whatever words you want to put to it. So from that point of view, the challenge I have found, and it's been true of my own work, but it's also when I've worked with other people about this, the challenge is differentiating what layer of the heart I'm actually listening from, and to start to discern, when am I in that second layer of the heart? Because it's very easy to say, well, what's your feeling about this? You say, well, my feeling is X, but it's actually coming from the second layer. And so it's learning to say, okay, well, let's stop and let's drop down into the next layer to start listening to that deeper voice about what's that actually has authenticity to it, and start to pay attention to it. But my experience of doing that is that the precondition for doing that kind of listening is surrenderance. And by that, I mean to say, and this has been my personal experience with it, that before I go to Baba, or somebody else may say to Jesus or to whoever, but before you go to that source of divinity within, to say, please give me the guidance that I'm looking for around this, but let me commit to you at the outset, whatever guidance you give me, as clear or as vague as it is, as long as I can get the guidance, I will follow it. I've learned that that's the key to being able to clear away the second layer and be able to actually drop into the third layer or beyond, and to be able to hear the guidance. You know,
Good. Yeah.
and there was one other thing I want to say about that, Rick, is there was a statement that I heard many years ago, that I heard attributed to Gurdjieff, and I've since seen it attributed to other people, which was, play with more than you can afford to lose, and you'll learn how to play the game. And
How do you interpret that?
I interpret that to mean that you need to, that there's certain times in my life when I've had to make decisions or, been faced with courses of action where I didn't feel I could afford to be wrong about them. That they were like, huge decisions. One of them was when I chose to adopt a child. And I'm saying, that's a huge decision. And I really wanted guidance about whether to do that. And I didn't think I could afford, that was more than I could afford to lose, was to be wrong about that one. And yet those are the kinds of things that I think putting yourself on the line, on these kinds of things is where you start. My experience is where I have started to really develop my own capacity for being able to follow my intuition. And I don't claim to be an expert at it or anything, but I've been working with it, that way for a long time. So,
yeah, there's that great quote. I think I heard you quote it in one of your talks about that guy. Who was it that said, there's great to commit yourself to a course of action, that once you do that, then all kinds of resources and support come your way, which otherwise wouldn't if you're wishy-washy. Remember, that quote?
Yeah, I do. It's from Henry Murray, and it's associated with a quote from Goethe,
right?
Which is, whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Okay, a couple of questions came in, so let me just pop those in and we'll continue. So this one is from someone whose initials are SS, asking, what did Mayor Baba say about the coming of the next world teacher or next avatar? What advice did he have for spiritual seekers at times before the next coming, when materialism accelerates?
That's a wonderful question. So let me create a somewhat larger context in my answer, if I will answer that directly. Baba said his next appearance as Avatar will come in 700 years. So, but he said that his current avataric advent has a power to it, and his presence is still with us, even though he dropped the body in 1969. That it would still be just as vital as it was when he was in the physical form for a period of 100 or so years after he drops this physical form. So in the period that we're in right now, Baba said he is the preeminent spiritual figure, and the opportunity for direct personal relationship with him is no different from what it was when he was physically here. In fact, it may even be more accessible at this point in time, and will be certainly throughout my lifetime, and probably the lifetime of many people who are on this call. So. Yeah.
You remember what Obi-Wan Kenobi said to Darth Vader? He said, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Unfortunately, that can be said about a number of historical figures that are not avatars.
Right. Yeah. But it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people feel like they really get zapped by Jesus, for instance, and he's been gone for 2,000 years. But they feel they have this direct, he's still intervening in their lives. So who knows?
So and Baba did, during his life, I mean, one of the things he did is he went around to a lot of, to different places, and he said he was revitalizing a lot of these places, whether they're, tomb shrines of great Sufi masters or perfect masters or this or that, and clearly revitalizing, world religions. And all you've got to do, you don't have to look any farther than Sufism to see there's been a huge revitalization of Sufism, in the world. I mean, I think, Rumi and Hafez are two of the most, widely read poets in the world today. And those are two great Sufi poets. And so that's a revitalization that Baba said, that as Avatar, that even though Jesus, died 2,000 years ago, and yes, there has been, Baba says there's a natural diminution of the power of the avatar that happens, where the avatar's influence and the fragrance of the avatar's presence begins to wane after 100 years or so, and then you get the growth of religions and antiquation of these kinds of things, and hierarchies and dogmas and rituals, and
Pedophilia.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, right. All that stuff that is really just a corruption of what the original impulse is. And the avatar does not come to create religion. It's just the religions grow up in their absence. But it's also true that the avatar, when the avatar comes, he does come and revitalizes all of the religions of the world. And Baba said part of his mission would be to bring together all religions together like beads on one string. He didn't come to replace religions. He came to awaken the vitalization of God within each religion, or within no religion at all.
Yeah. On a note, Maharishi told a story one time about something that happened with his master. His master was Shankaracharya of Jyotirmath in the Himalayas, and people would pray to him, for health or have to have a child or whatever that people pray for. And very often their prayers would be fulfilled. And Maharishi asked his master about that. He said, what are the mechanics of that? I mean, are you aware of these prayers? I mean, how is it that their prayers get fulfilled? And he said, it is the department of the absolute, and he takes care of it. And Maharishi said it took him a long time to understand what that meant. But I think what it means, and I think he might have explained it, is that however you conceive of the divine, either in the form of a master or deceased or still living or whatever, if you make the treaty, if you have the sankalpa or the intention or the prayer for something, that prayer or that intention gets heard. Krishna says this in the Gita. He says, as men approach me, so do I favor them. Anyone who sort of has sincere motivation or whatever, I hear it, I respond to it. But the intelligence that is speaking there is omnipresent, it's universal. And so Maharishi's teacher, his master, wasn't necessarily aware of these things, but he was just a figurehead which they could, relate to in order to submit their request. But the divine intelligence, which is everywhere, was able to fulfill the request, irrespective of the knowledge of the man who they were praying to. I don't know if that would apply with Baba, but it might be a principle of the way these things work.
So I think what Baba said is that I think relates to what you're saying, but I'll give you a different mechanic around it. That Baba spoke about. So Baba talked about what he called the spiritual hierarchy. And he said the spiritual hierarchy consists of all of the individuals who are on the evolutionary planes of consciousness, the 6 planes of consciousness beyond the gross physical plane, which he's gone into in quite a bit of depth, both in God Speaks and a number of other.
So like
other
angels,
places.
Ascended masters, just sort of beings on higher planes of existence.
Beings on higher planes,
right?
Beings on higher planes,
right? And they hear you.
And Baba, when he comes to the perfect masters are the head of the spiritual hierarchy. And when the avatar comes, he assumes the position that is called the Kutub-i-Urshid, which is the head of the spiritual hierarchy. And it's interesting just to say, I can tell you a story about the spiritual hierarchy in a moment if you're interested. But he said that Baba said he didn't come to do these kind of minor miracles for people. He said, don't come to me for, health, wealth, body, positions like that. He said, I'm the one to take, not the one to give, just to say. He was absolutely clear about that. He said, if you want a miracle, if you want something, go to a saint. A saint can give you what you want, and go there. He said, but don't come to me for that. All I have to give is love. All I have to give is God. And that's all I want to give, like that. So he said that. And he would say he didn't do miracles. And he said there were so many miracles that are associated with Meher Baba that are very well documented. But Baba said that when he hears about these miracles, and again, this is where Baba can hides his omniscience in his sort of manhood. He said Baba would say, when people come to me and they tell me all these miracles, it's news to me. I don't know anything about them. So like, great, great. You prayed for a child, you got a child. You prayed for a good job, you got a good job. Well, two things about that the spiritual hierarchy, it's also been posited that the spiritual hierarchy, that when prayers are given like that, or requests or beseechments or whatever you call them, that a member of the spiritual hierarchy may take over and do them, and they take that on. That's a little bit like your department that I think I'm hearing you speak of about Maharishi's master, about how he explained it. That it's like in a large organization, the CEO doesn't know everything that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's like some underling down here says, "Oh, he wants that. Okay, let me give him the child, or let me give him the job, or let me help him get out of jail." Or something.
Oh, did you ever watch Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth series? Remember that scene where Ernest Borgnine played a Roman centurion or general or officer of some kind, and he came to Jesus and he said, I forget who he was asking for help for, but my mother, whoever, is sick and really needs your help. Could you come there? And Jesus said, how did it go? No, he didn't ask him to come there. He just said, could you please help? And Jesus said, okay, well, I'll go there and I'll take care of her. And the general said, Ernest Borgnine said, no, you don't need to go there. He said, I'm a general. And if I want something done, I just command my troops and they take care of it. So all you have to do is have that intention, and I'm sure she'll be fine. And, and Jesus really appreciated his insight and his faith.
That was such a beautiful movie.
Yeah.
I saw that movie when it came out. It was on television, and right after I called up Kitty Davey, who I was very close with by that point, and I asked her if she'd seen it, which she had. And I said, "What did you think of it?" She said, "Well, it didn't remind her of who Baba was. It wasn't the man who played Jesus didn't remind her of Baba in the way he played him, but she said it did remind her of who she felt Jesus was." Yeah,
it was a beautiful thing. And anyone who hasn't seen that, it's Franco Zeffirelli. There are about 6 different segments to it. It's a big, long thing. He's the same one who did Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon about St. Francis.
And he's an atheist.
Oh, was he? I'll be darned. I didn't know that.
And I thought he had, what I thought was interesting about that film, since you mentioned it, I thought because Baba talked a lot about Jesus, or he talked about Jesus. And he said the reason why Jesus did all the miracles was to make sure he got crucified. That he didn't do them to have fun or to sort of, set himself up. He did it to
push
create
people's buttons.
To push. And so when you watch the film, and when Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, and you see all of these people, or a better one is with the loaves and the fishes, where all these people are just ecstatic about all the fish and all the bread and all this. And you look at Jesus's face, and you can see he's not ecstatic. It's like a chessboard he's arranged, and he's setting all the pieces up to help effect the result that he's looking for there. So I thought it was an incredibly insightful film.
Yeah, cool. Fascinating that Zeffirelli was an atheist. Okay, here's another question. This is from Rob McHugh in Columbia, South Carolina. Can you speak to any experience you've had in connection with Meher Baba of not being the doer? After some recent time at the center, there has been a kind of, so in other words, he has visited Myrtle Beach, your center. After there has been a kind of a flow of events happening in which there seems to be no other explanation than I am not the doer.
Wow. Let's see. I'd have to really think about that one. I am not the doer. I have had many experiences where I felt Baba took over, which I think is probably what he's talking about, and where I seem to be, I'm just following the breadcrumbs of what he's laid out for me, and I can just step into the places that he opens up, and I can go there. And some of them have been sort of like, just extraordinary kinds of quote synchronicities or coincidences like that. But I'd say my life in general has been like that for me. I felt like Baba, the way I've experienced Baba is creating openings in my life and then inviting me to step into them. And whether that's at a career level, because he's given me extraordinary opportunities, to sort of work in very different kinds of extraordinary kinds of situations. Personally, opportunities to serve him that just open up out of nowhere, and all of a sudden I'm invited in to do something that, is the fulfillment of some longing inside myself, but has gone unexpressed. and all of a sudden there it is, and I can do it. So I've been given lots and lots of opportunities like that in my life with Baba. I wouldn't generally describe my life with Baba as supernatural. And I don't think Baba's way was generally, quote, supernatural. I don't think that's, though I can certainly say there are many people who've had, quote, supernatural experiences with Baba, but it's not how I would generally describe Baba's way. I would describe Baba's way as being the most natural way. And so I remember, going through a very difficult personal period where I was feeling very isolated in my life for over some very intense personal things happening. And a lot of this people that I've been associated with, the community I've been associated with, kind of disappeared from my life for a period of time. But out of nowhere, there appeared two people who were brand new to me, who became extremely important friends and supports for me to help me get through that period. And that's an example of what again, there's nothing supernatural about it, but it was like, wow, you look back on it and say, that is so extraordinary that happened. I couldn't have planned that. I couldn't have thought that was the solution to my problem, or a healer shows up that was extremely, just the perfect person for me to work with out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And that's happened to me many, many, many times. So those are some examples that I associate with the question.
Another angle for his question is that, superficially, we're an individual. Fundamentally, we're pure consciousness, and pure consciousness doesn't do anything. And so when you awaken to your nature as pure consciousness, you may very well have the sense that I do not act at all. I'm not doing anything, even though there seems to be all this doing happening, but it's not me doing it. There are a bunch of verses in the Gita about that too. Okay, so we still have a lot to cover, but we should talk about the musts a little bit.
Yeah. Great. So this is an extraordinary part of Baba's life, and it consumed much of, I would say, up to 15 years of his life was his work with what are called musts. The actual Sufi word is must-e-Allah. And these are individuals who have achieved advanced states of consciousness. They're not on the gross physical level. They're on either the subtle level or the mental level, but they are extremely advanced beings. But they are they're lost in states of enchantment.
And they're human living beings. They're not just
yes.
other
they're living beings.
Yeah, right.
They're living beings. And you see them. There was one who lived in Mehrabad, where Meher Baba's center is in India, that many of us who would go there and over the years, got to know. His name was Muhammad, and he was on the fifth or sixth plane of consciousness, and they can seem very, very peculiar. That they're not. They seem on the manifest level like they might even be mentally deranged. But in fact, Baba said they're the farthest thing from mentally deranged that there can be. But he said the average person cannot tell the difference between a madman and a must. And some of these musts live, that as exalted as their states of consciousness are, that their physical circumstances can be the reflection of the exact opposite of that state of exaltation. So they can live in places, some of them live in urinals, in India. And if you've ever been in a urinal in India, that's not a place most people would like to live. So, and they can be dressed in rags. Some of them are naked, and just, and so Baba did a tremendous amount of work. I think over his lifetime, I believe he contacted 1,000 or 2,000 musts, and he contacted them one by one to work with them. And his work with them was twofold. And this is all very well documented work in a book called The Wayfarers by a man named William Donkin, who was involved with Baba. And Baba would travel around India on what he called must tours, and he would take his mandali with him, and they would travel, miles and miles and miles in the most rudimentary circumstances, in bullock carts and trains and whatever it took but Bob was always intent on finding these musts. And they sometimes, travel miles through swamps to a village where there was a must. And when Baba would find the must, the work that Baba would do the must, Baba said, was twofold. The first part of the work was to help the must spiritually, because they're in a state of enchantment, that they're kind of stuck. Like the spiritual path it's a path of progress. It's a continual progress toward the goal, which is God realization. But if you get lost in a state of enchantment, you stop moving forward. And so these musts are kind of stuck in these states of enchantment. And so Baba's work with them was to help dislodge them from the states of enchantment. And how he did that, no one knows. I mean, this is inner work that Baba did with the musts, and he did it very often in seclusion, though not always. But one could not see any kind of manifest form of the musts.
Well, it was done for Baba himself in a way. I mean, you said, he was just not eating or closing his eyes for 9 months, and some guy worked with him for a while. Shirdi Sai Baba's disciple worked with him and got him more integrated.
That's right. You could see that as a counterpart.
So did these guys become more normal after Baba had worked with them?
It became somewhat more
out
normal.
Of the urinal or whatever.
They were able to keep moving. They were able to keep moving spiritually. They didn't necessarily change their physical circumstances that much, from what I can see. Mm-hmm. Baba said that actually the experience of being a must for some musts actually impacted their brains. So there was a certain amount of mental damage that was done. But he said in their next birth, they would experience normal brains, and they would come back at the state of consciousness that they had achieved, and they would move on from there. So, so it's a fascinating part of his work.
And I presume that the purpose, it had a larger purpose than just helping these 1,000 or 2,000 guys, because somehow they were pivotal in the shift of world consciousness, and by freeing them up in their progress, he was enacting a larger influence in the world.
Absolutely, because Baba said the second. So I said there were two purposes in his work with the musts. One was to help them spiritually, and the second one was to give them a share of his universal work. Mm-hmm. So Baba said his universal work had to be, that he shared his universal work amongst the spiritual hierarchy. It's the job of the spiritual hierarchy is to carry out the plan that Baba puts in place that is going to affect the change, the transformation of consciousness. But it's being done at such a broad, universal or multi-universal level that the entire spiritual hierarchy participates in it. So he was able to use the musts to help carry forth a portion of that work, which of course was helpful for the musts too. Anytime you do service for God, you're actually serving yourself. Baba said, you're not serving anybody else.
You're really the prime beneficiary.
Yeah, you're right. You are the primary beneficiary. So that was Baba's work with the musts.
And it seemed like he worked with a number of proxies like that. He would work with poor people, washing their feet and putting his forehead on their feet, and work with lepers or animals and different things. And somehow I read somewhere that in doing that, he felt like it was having a ripple effect for all people of that sort. They were like just representatives of the larger circle of poor people or sick people or whatever.
It's a really good point. And I don't know that Baba ever said that per se. Baba was not prone to explaining himself, just to say. So, a lot of what
someone else who was explaining that was
right.
Their interpretation of it.
I think they're fair interpretations, but they are interpretations. But Baba, one thing that in the 1920s, Baba was in Mehrabad, which became his primary headquarters in India and is still today. And, he set up hospitals and, free hospitals always, and ashrams, and he had schools and free schools and, all kinds of stuff like that. And then he would have these things operating for a while. And all of a sudden, on a moment's notice, he would end them. And okay, we're ending the school, we're ending the hospital.
That's been rather inconvenient for the people in the school or the hospital.
He always arranged for them. He,
Okay.
invariably
Get
he
them
took
into
care.
another school or something.
That's right. He invariably did that with anyone who was dependent upon him.
Mhm.
Before he would end things, he would make sure there was the money for them or the circumstances that supported them. But people would ask him, like, this hospital is really great. Why, it's really doing good work. Why don't you do it? And Baba would say, the metaphor Baba used for that, he described that as the scaffolding of his work. He said the work he's doing is at a totally different level of reality of what he's doing through these hospitals and schools and ashrams. He's creating something at a whole different level. And so what we see is sort of the external part of the work, but he said, actually, it's like the scaffolding of a building. That the hospital itself is just scaffolding. And he said, just like in a building, when the building's done, you take the scaffolding down. That was how Baba described all of that.
Quite an inscrutable character, the way he worked.
Oh, yeah.
Did he say more about the new humanity in terms of, was he predicting like an age of enlightenment or a golden age or something like that? And did he elaborate on what that might be like and when it might dawn?
So, in his discourses, in the book of discourses, and folks who are watching this who are not familiar with them, it's really a beautiful, extraordinary book of discourses on different topics about the spiritual life. And one of the first of the discourses is called The New Humanity. And this was back in the 30s, just to say, way before New Age stuff was being talked about generally. And he did say that there was going to be a coming period of the new humanity that would be a period of spiritual experience, I don't know that he used the word enlightenments, but you can sort of associate that word with a world time of cooperation, of brotherhood and sisterhood, of a much higher frequency of being that people would operate on when the new humanity happened. So he talked about that in the early years, and then I think it's fair to say that the breaking of his silence is a major factor in what he said would be the condition that would bring about this period of the new humanity. But he said it would definitely come. I was interviewed by Deepak Chopra once on his radio show, and he asked me whether or not I believed that there would be a transformation of consciousness. And I said to him, I do believe that there will be one, because Mayor Baba has said that there will be one. And I think what Mayor Baba said, I take as true, the truth. But I said, if you look at where things are headed right now, it looks like we're headed toward a gigantic train wreck. I said, if you look at the trends, whether it's, at the time I was doing a lot of work in the field of pandemics, and this was years ago, way before COVID and all that. And I said, if you look at the trends around global health and pandemics, or you look at social trends or environmental trends, or, you name it, it's not looking good. It's looking like everything's going to converge at this one point. And, it looks pretty dark. And I said, I think it's fair to assume that whatever transformation and emergence of a new humanity occurs, it will happen, but it will happen out of that kind of process, just like it is for me as an individual, or any individual. Before there's genuine transformation, there's a reckoning that has to occur, all of the forces inside of us that we hold in our subconscious that are holding us in place, they have to come to the surface. And they have to be faced and then released to allow transformation to occur. And if that's true at an individual level, and, I've had my experience in individual transformation, I'm sure you have too, Rick, that, I think we know that that's true, that's the price of transformation is burning. And so if that's true individually, it's got to be true collectively too. So I think it will happen. But Baba never put a date on things like that. Baba said, he never said exactly when it would happen or what it would exactly look like. And again, I think that's probably something that we will, whether it's an event in and of itself or whether it's this gradual emergence, but it looks to me like there's the seeds, and Baba said this too, that the seeds of the new humanity are, they've been growing for some time now. and you have 100,000 listeners now. That's extraordinary. And that's this is not the only place that people are awakening. They're awakening all over the world.
Yeah.
So.
And you're not going to see that on the 6 o'clock news. So those who are measuring these trends, pandemics and economics and all this stuff, they're usually not aware at all of the kind of the spiritual tide that's coming in, that's rising and hopefully lifting all boats except those which are anchored won't be might capsize as the tide rises. There's a cool thing I picked up from one of the books. It talked about the Sufi teaching about the Jamal and the Jalal. That the Jamal is the garden and the Jalal is the fire, or something like that, and that being in the garden, the main growth being in the garden is nice, but the main growth takes place in the fire. But you have to be in the garden in order to build up the capacity to be in the fire. So what you were just saying about having to sort of be purged of all the sort of dross, stored up samskaras or negativities or whatever in order to make spiritual progress. So you get to hang out in the garden a bit to gain the wherewithal, the capacity to undergo that ordeal.
Yeah, I mean, the Sufis that I was associated with when I did the Sufi healing work, and I think it's true for myself, though it's a little hard to say it. But you got to the point where you actually preferred the Jalal to the Jamal, because you knew that the Jalal was where you were actually going to start shedding these parts of yourself that were keeping you from being able to experience those higher states, that higher consciousness. So we
used to call it unstressing in the TM movement. We'd go on long courses, 6 months of long meditations, and all kinds of stuff would come out. It's like the Beatles wrote Dear Prudence because Prudence Farrow was just holed up in her little cabin, for days meditating and getting really crazy as this all the her drug experiences and whatnot were unwound.
It's not fun.
But then when you're done with it, boy, you feel like you've kind of like gone on the course as a broken down jalopy and you're coming out as a new Mercedes or something. You feel a big transformation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a path. This is the path of freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom means you're letting go. That's the condition of being free. It's letting go.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff about samskaras or impressions that I've been listening to and reading about in these books. And one thing that kind of puzzles me is this whole thing about balancing out positive and negative samskaras. So, I can see how we, over the course of many lifetimes, go through all kinds of experience. We've been murdered, we've been murderers, we've been this, we've been that. We've experienced sort of the polarities, both sides of the coin, in order for karma to get balanced out. But there was a strange story in one of the books about some guy who had supposedly, this is a hypothetical story, I'm sure, who had supposedly murdered some 99 people or something, and then went to the jungle and murdered one more person, and then he got enlightened because he had helped, because he had previously helped 100 people in previous lives, and he had to balance out his samskaras by murdering 100 in order to get enlightenment. Baba, but then, I don't know, but then Baba said that it's easier to break through the prison of good than the prison of bad. So even positive samskaras can be a prison, gold chains instead of iron chains. But I guess the issue for me is that, good works don't necessarily lead to enlightenment, but they create a condition within us that is more conducive to enlightenment than evil works. And that's because sattva, or purity, is more translucent than tamas, or impurity. So, and again, this has plenty of scriptural support, that you can, like in Vedanta, for instance, it's taught that, you can't necessarily just leap to the highest state, but you can go through all kinds of selfless service and devotional things and meditation practices and other things to create greater and greater purity. Or as one Zen teacher put it, enlightenment may be an accident, but spiritual practice makes you accident prone. So, so this whole thing about, equal good and bad gets you so balanced that then you can get enlightened just sounds a little odd to me. I wonder if you want to comment on that.
I mean, I think the story about the 99 murders is just a metaphor. It's just it's just trying to make a point. I don't think
It's not a recommended spiritual practice.
No, but the thing I would say about that is Zoroaster, the first of the known appearances of the Avatar in recorded history, his precepts were good thoughts, good words, good deeds.
Yeah.
And I take that as being, that's a good thing. I mean, that's, these are the things that are given to the general population to sort of, because, in general, this is a good thing to do. But as you get closer to actually the spiritual path, and by the way, Baba says the spiritual path doesn't even begin until the first plane of consciousness, just to say.
We haven't really defined these planes, but
that's right.
Maybe
no, we haven't
have a chance. I don't know.
All right. But anyway, he said, but as you get closer to that the terms, I think, start to change quite a bit. And that the issue isn't so much whether you do good or bad. The issue is what's your attachment to what you're doing, which of course is what Krishna spoke about with Arjuna, about, you do what you do, but be in the world, but not of it. Do your duty, do your
responsibility. For the fruits of action. Yeah.
And there's a place that Baba said, and I think this is really, this is so right on. He said, living with me, and I'm like, it's like I'm quoting him. I'm not giving an exact quote, but it's like this: living with me is not about leading a moral life. He said, this is not the ideal life. He said, in a moral life, you try to live a virtuous life. He said, that's fine for a moral life, but it's not really a spiritual life. He said, because in that kind of life, your actions may be virtuous, but the evil part of you is still being repressed. So it's not like that's getting you, it's taking you very far. It certainly keeps you from getting more bad evil sanskaras, but it's not really doing the work of balancing out your sanskaras. He said, when you're with me, it's a natural life where both the good and the bad come out, but as they come out, then they can be nullified, and then you can actually rise above them. And he said, that's what it means to live with a spiritual master. And I don't take that to mean, physically live with them. I think that's the opportunity I feel I have in my life with Baba, which feels very vital and alive and real and current with me. I think it's the opportunity anybody has is to lead a life. When he says lead a life with me, he means inwardly to stay connected with me, is what he's talking about there. So, the good and bad stuff, the good and the bad have to ultimately balance themselves out. But when you get to a master, that the job of the master is to eliminate sanskaras. That's why you go to a master, is for the elimination of sanskaras, according to Baba. And so the master is the one who is actually in the best position, because the master knows the sanskaras of their followers and is able to create the circumstances for allowing those sanskaras to actually come up, and then the master can then work on the eradication of them. And that's how.
But if you act on some scars, you reinforce them. So let's say you're in the presence of a master and you start experiencing a lot of lust or something like that.
Sure.
The master presumably doesn't send you to the red light district.
Right.
I mean, you're able to sort of sit there and have that burned off in the master's presence. Right. So it is coming out, but it's not being reinforced by acting on it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. The working out of sanskaras doesn't mean acting them out.
Right.
It means
that would really be a mess.
It means unwinding them. It means going through the experience of them, but not giving them the energy and then the physical expression. That's
which is what we did on those long courses I was talking about. I mean, you'd be meditating, most of the day for weeks, months on end, and all kinds of stuff would come up, and you'd want to do all sorts of things that you couldn't do under the circumstances. And Maharishi would just keep saying, "Go by the clock." Just stay in the routine. Don't marry your next door neighbor or whatever you're wanting to do. And just burn this stuff off, and it'll be a lot clearer when you're done.
Yeah, same. Sounds the same thing. Baba said that all of his teachings are based on sanskaras. He said, because that's the whole ball of wax. It's what's keeping us bound to these false identities that keep us from knowing who our real self is.
Teachings are based on samskaras. What does that mean? exactly.
It means that everything he's teaching about the spiritual life is essentially about how can we manage our
how
samskara.
to clear them out. All right. How do we, attenuate the sanskara?
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, that helps to clear that up. So what major areas here have we not covered? I think we've covered most of them. I mean, there's a whole thing about the scales of evolution, which are covered in God Speaks, and how souls start out as stone or as gas, perhaps. I don't know. Is it gas? I mean, that's the way the universe starts. It's all hydrogen and helium. And then
Subgases.
Yeah. We don't have much but gas after the Big Bang, and then eventually go through various stone, metal, vegetable, worm, fish, bird, animal, and then human. So one just a kind of a, and I can relate to that. I mean, that seems to be an interesting cosmology, but one thing I've always been curious about, if that's how it works, is the abundance of souls in lower life forms. I mean, there are a heck of a lot more amoebas in a pond than there are probably, human beings on Earth. And so if each amoeba has its own soul, or each mosquito or each sparrow or something, what happens to all those souls? Because we don't have that many humans. Is it like a whole beehive has a soul, and then it becomes eventually, that soul eventually rises up and I was once a beehive in some long lost incarnation? Or did he say anything about the mechanics of that?
I never heard anything that he said about that, but I've had the same wonderings about that, because you're talking about group souls, for example, as an example of what that is. I don't really have an answer for that, Rick. I have wondered about the mathematics of all of this and how does it work. I just read today that there are 10 quintillion insects on the earth. Yeah. Just to sort of, give a number to what you're talking about. So it is a pretty sobering thing, and I don't have any answer to that as to whether there's what Bob has said about that.
All right, so I was just curious. And he also talked about the higher planes, like I guess, for instance, there's a whole thing about people on the fourth plane, whatever that is, higher than you or I are probably at, which if they begin to get siddhis, and if they use them for nefarious purposes or for entertainment or to show off or whatever, they can end up falling back to the level of rock and having to work their way, or stone, having to work their way back through hey, your name is Stone, aren't you worried?
I try not to read too much into that.
So that's an interesting thing about, and then he also spoke of higher planes from which you can no longer fall. You're beyond the possibility of falling.
Yeah. So Baba, I mean, God Speaks, again, if it's a brilliant text about the structure, the purpose and structure of creation. Being I'm a systems thinker kind of guy. That's what I do for a living. So and it's very much of a systems orientation toward understanding creation. But what Baba says is that there are three basic phases in the journey of the soul from the state of God unconscious to God conscious. And the first of them is through the evolution of consciousness through form, which is what you talked about, stone, mineral, bird, fish, so on, up to human form. And then there's the process in the human form of what he calls reincarnation. And he said that typically it takes 8,400,000 lifetimes in a human form to progress to the point where you're ready to enter into the planes of involution. And then there's a process of going beyond the gross physical form into these inner states. And he describes 6 different inner states, planes of consciousness, the first 3 of which are in what he calls the subtle world, which is the world of energy. And then there's a 4th plane, which is the transitional plane. And then the 2 highest planes, the 5th and 6th, are in the mental planes. The 5th plane be the plane of thought, and the 6th plane being the plane of feeling. And Baba describes describes each of these planes and what the experiences of the planes and what you call the cities or the powers are that one has in each of these planes. And they're quite substantial. I mean, in the second plane, you can bring, dead things back to life. In the fourth plane, Baba said you can actually create an entire universe breathing with life, just to give a sense about what these powers are, that these aren't, things, we think of things, people that have sort of, powers of mind reading, things like that. They're really, most of those are in the astral planes, before you even get to the first plane. So, you're talking about when you get to the first plane, it is such a plane of such advanced consciousness that many people, when they get there, think that they've actually arrived at the goal of God consciousness, because it is so blissful and it is so advanced and so completely divorced from what their previous experience was. But they're actually just at the beginning of the planes of evolution. And you go from the first to the second to the third, and you get to the fourth. And that's the plane where you actually have universal power. And you have all the power, that there is, infinite power at your disposal. And as you said, if you use it, Baba said, if you use it well, that is to help support help other people in their own spiritual advancement and their own spiritual ongoing, it's fine. And it will help you advance into the fifth plane. But if you misuse it for any kind of personal egoic purposes, then you do risk falling down as far as all the way back to the stone stage. But Baba did say that when somebody gets to the fourth plane, there's usually a fifth or sixth planer or above who are watching them to make sure that they don't misuse the powers and that they intervene to prevent it from happening. So it's a horrendous idea. Just imagine going through that. But Baba says it's also rare, but it's important. It's really important. It's important to be aware of that as a cautionary note.
Yeah.
And so
there's an interesting book called Initiation by Elizabeth H. You ever read that book?
I think I read it a long time.
And she had remembered having been, alive back in ancient Egypt, and she made some mistake and ended up going into the stone state. But over the next 4,000 years ago or so, she evolved out of that again back to being a fairly evolved human being. So it's not like she had to go through billions of years of evolution as might have happened the first time around.
That name will be.
Yeah. Anyway, a lot of this stuff is very hypothetical, and people can choose to take it as the gospel truth because Baba says it, or they can choose to take it as hypotheses interesting to ponder. I'm kind of that way myself, the latter, with just about everything. But I'm open to the possibility that all these things are the way they are, and just to have a kind of a scientific attitude toward it.
I think all of this stuff that Baba gave, about these teachings, I personally find it very profound and very compelling and persuasive.
Yeah.
But the essence of Baba is not that. The essence of Baba is love. And Baba made that clear. And that Baba, it wasn't that Baba insisted that people believe any of these things. In fact, Baba said that actually belief for most people is actually a pretty superficial level of personality. It doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
He said what matters is the condition of the heart. And so Baba's emphasis was always on awakening the heart. And what he wanted people to do was to develop their love, the love relationship with him, and to enter into that relation. And that's what he offered people. He said, that's really what I have to, that's really what I'm here to offer you, is the opportunity to establish a relationship with divine love. And the way you do that is to tap inside your own heart, find me inside your own heart. Baba said, I'm not this body. Don't confuse me with being this body. This body is just a cloak. It's a coat. I put it on so you can see me, so you can establish a relationship with me. Once we've established that relationship, the cloak's no longer necessary. And so he always de-emphasized the physicality of his being, and he always said to people, find me here, find me inside your heart. That's where I live. That's where you'll find me, and that's where you can know me. So that's.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it back to that, because all these metaphysical speculations, if people thought that that's what he was all about, then they could just debate endlessly about whether these things are true and this and that, but it wouldn't do them much good. But like you just say, the blossoming of the heart is what's important, and that, I guess, was his primary objective for everyone.
Yeah. His total objective.
Good. All right. Well, thanks, Daniel. This has been an interesting conversation, and I'm glad I had a few weeks without another interview, so as to just really plunge into all of this and read all these books and everything. And I'm sorry if I haven't become like an avid Baba devotee all this. But it took you a few years, I heard you say. So, but it's just been fascinating, getting to know him more by and getting exposed to all this. I've enjoyed it.
Rick, I've really enjoyed it. I really appreciated the preparation you did for this interview. I was really, really impressed by it, and just your questions. I think were just really thoughtful, thought-provoking, and really, exploring really important things. And I've really been happy to be able to sit here with you and kind of share what I've been able to share. So
great. Well, thank you, Daniel. Oh, and so, okay, so you're down there near Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and there's a center there, and I imagine that there, like that fellow Rob McHugh said, he had visited there recently, so that's a place people can come to, and there must be retreats or programs or something there.
Yeah, no, the center here is for anyone who's interested in Meher Baba, who wants to heard about him, wants to know more. It's a beautiful center. We've got about a square mile of wildlife refuge right on the ocean. We've got a mile-long beachfront, and we've got cabins, and people can come here for retreat. Baba was here 3 times in the 1950s, and Baba said of all the places he'd ever visited, this is the place he loved the most. And he said he would never leave. And people come here because they can experience Baba's presence really in such a vivid way here. When they come, people come from all over the world. And we don't have a retreat program per se. People come here and they do they pursue their own inner relationship with him in whatever way they want. But we do have programs that go on that people are welcome to attend. There are talks, or there are music programs, or discourse readings, or things like that are available to people. But there's certainly no compunction to do them, because the real essence of coming to the center here in Myrtle Beach is to experience Baba's presence, and we make it affordable for people, so it's not a difficult thing to do. And as I said, it's a beautiful wildlife refuge here. We have a mile-long freshwater lake just adjacent to the ocean, and we've got wild animals on the property and all that. And so it's
sounds great.
Just
so somebody can just come and pay a modest fee and stay in a cabin for a week and do a personal retreat and plug into some activities if there are any. And
Absolutely.
Great. There's meals. I imagine they can just come and get their meals.
We don't serve meals. People, there are communal kitchens, that people can
in the cabins.
And they can do that. And if you go to mehercenter.org, that's where you can get all the information about coming and learn a little bit more about Baba.
Okay.
And then we have, there are other retreat properties, around, and other centers for Baba
around the world
in the U.S. And so,
Good. Yeah. Well, I'll make sure that I'll link to the mayorcenter.org, and I've also created a page where there'll be links to various other resources, like some of these books I've mentioned can be downloaded for free from various websites. And anyway, you guys don't seem to be about the money. It's a lot you can tune into.
Baba never wanted money to be a factor for people.
Yeah, that's great.
So
Good. Well, thanks, Daniel. Appreciate spending time with you.
Yeah, me too, Rick. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll be in touch.
Okay. Take care.
Okay, bye. Thanks, everybody.
So these are the survivors.
Wow.
We're the hangers on, Dan. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah.
Well done. Well done. Beautifully shared.
Thank you.
From the heart.
I'll third that. Very well done. Good job. Good efforts.
Yeah, it was like watching a dance. It was really artful. Daniel. I can't say enough. It was so incredibly rich that it's hard to pick out any particular one thing or even for questions because, wow, I don't know how you managed to run the gamut that you did, but it was such an act of love, and I'm grateful that I got to be here today.
Thank you.
Seems to me a focus of 50 years of being with Baba could help to support that being able to do that, that. But I had a couple of things to talk, just to comment on, just a couple of comments at the content that was in there. One of the things I noticed was when Rick asked about the new humanity, and my recollection that of Baba's description of the new humanity, there's really almost nothing very specific that Baba said to describe the new humanity, except in one interview that Baba had in the 30s with a reporter who came, and he mentioned that in this new humanity, people, when they would see somebody that had less resources than themselves, they would feel ashamed that there was somebody that had less than them, which is pretty much the exact opposite of what's more typical in the paradigm that we're living in and have been living in for a long time. But that would be something. So I always think that is maybe the most important aspect of it, that attitude change. And then the other thing that I noticed is when he brought up that story of the murderer, the fellow that had murdered all those people, and then went to I can't remember if he went to Buddha or if he just went to a perfect master, but he was given the instruction to go to a particular place, which was out in the woods or something, in a remote area, and not to leave the spot, and that his needs would be seen to by some disciples of the master and stuff. And he stayed there, and he was told to meditate and repeat God's name and whatever, some type of spiritual life that he was going to lead. And it went on for many years. And the years of that, of doing that, kind of was a condensed spiritual path that he went on. And during that time, apparently, it was God's will enabled there to be this fellow that would ride through the area after it had been changed into like a town that grew up around the guy, and he was on his way to deliver a message that 100 people would be killed inappropriately, and he was able to save them unknowingly by committing that one other murder. But I think it's a good depiction of how God's will works in these amazing ways, and I think we can have our own experiences of how Baba sets these things in motion. You even related some of them, Daniel. How these things occur in our lives that seem perfect and natural.
Yeah. I'm trying. I remember the story the way you just said it, Ron, and I'm trying to remember is the difference between the way Erich would tell a story in Mondley Hall with all the embellishments and the actual quote from the discourse about that, which I think the discourse is actually a simple version of it, as I recalled it, and I think that's what he was referring to. I'd have to go back to the discourses and actually find that passage and verify it, but I believe that Baba treats it very, very simply in the discourses. And then, but Erich, I do remember him telling stories that way, where all the embellishments are there. And maybe that is in fact how he heard it from Baba directly, but it may be different from what the discourse itself is. I'd have to go back. And if you can find that yourself and let me know, that'd be great. So any other thoughts or comments? I appreciate what you're saying, Ron. Any other thoughts or comments or questions or anything you want to say?
Hi, hey, Baba.
Hey, Jay, Baba, Jeff.
Daniel, I have a few questions I want to ask.
Sure.
I've written them down, but they're in my brain for quite a while. Years, actually. So one of my questions is about being present. Now, we all love to be present with Baba. We all love to say his name. We all embrace Baba. We know he's embracing us. My first question is, we all, every single hour, every single day, it's overstating it, we're reacting at various times throughout the day. At least everybody I know is, without exception. Some a lot less than others. So my first question is, I don't see any of Baba's teachings or anything devoted to working with reactivity. In parentheses, I listened to some of Tara Brack's talks on radical acceptance and Pema Chodron. She wrote a book, Hooked on a Feeling. We have a lot of feelings, and some of them are loving and bonding and easily gratifying. A lot is not. Now, what seems to me to be lacking in Baba meetings I've been going to for many, many years, that's the first question I'm asking. It's not addressed. And the karma and the samskaras are all intertwined. We know this. But without belaboring this with other words, you know what I'm really asking. I should have said it very tersely. Why isn't there any work being done with the Baba lover on reactivity? Consciously, because I know you mentioned earlier, you go to a certain group of people who you get a lot of support from that group. I also, because we're dealing with a certain level of awareness, which I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So could you respond to that first question, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, you raised a couple of things there, Jeff. So I'll just give you my thoughts about it. I don't know that I have the answer to your question, but I'll give you my thoughts.
Please, thank you.
So let me address it at a couple of levels. The first one is that what Baba put out by way of teachings and discourses and like that, he said that when he breaks his silence, he said he's not come to give all these teachings, but when he breaks his silence, all the words he has not spoken will be said through the mouths of human beings, others. In other words, I feel like Baba, my interpretation is Baba very particularly did not fill in all, dot all the I's and cross all the T's for us about a lot of these things, because he wanted us to start to discover these things for our own intuitive awarenesses. And so rather than sort of spoon feeding us with every single idea and thought like that, he gave us the big picture. He certainly did give the big picture, as far as I'm concerned, about the question of reactivity, because he talks about sanskaras. And he says all, sanskaras are the basis of reactivity. Baba said all of his teachings are based on sanskaras.
Yes.
So it's understanding that sanskaras are what's driving us in all of our reactions. And
Yes.
he gave us the solution to that, which is remembrance. It's the one thing that Baba gave us, all of us, as the methodology for connecting with him, is to remember him in our hearts. And that remembrance, and he said, use his name for that, or he said use a photograph of him, or a picture of him, or an image of him, or of any God realized being, if it's not him, if it's Jesus or Krishna or Buddha or whatever it is. But he said, to use either the name or the image, but especially his name and image, because it's the freshest. That was the solution that he really gave to that challenge.
Let,
And it's
let, let me respond to that.
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
mean to cut you off. So I'm at a Baba meeting in Asheville where I lived for many years.
Yeah.
And something very unusual happened. We're at somebody's home, and Tom Riley, beloved Tom Riley, asked someone in that meeting, because there was a long pause, and he said, so and so, what is surrender mean to you? And that person paused and thought about it. And just as the person was about to speak, because the person was pretty close to me, someone in the group said, I won't emotionalize the tone, but they said, don't answer that question. And it wasn't a happy tone. I watched that person leave, going up to that person and saying, I'm sorry for doing that. Interestingly enough, as I'm getting into my car, another Baba lover I know many years said to me, this meeting was very interesting. I realized I have to work on my anger. I'm not going to mention names. And I was so blown away that this woman was vulnerable and that honest. And it meant a lot to me that all that stuff kind of happened. I never said at any of the Baba meetings I ever went to for 9 years, Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. Jesus said, love one another as I've loved you. He didn't say you have to like one another. You know what I mean? But Jesus, when Baba was Jesus, he said, love one another as I have loved you. And a lot of us are into that heart, that bhakti yoga. But even on the center, there have been situations with longtime Baba lovers who have really bothered some people. I won't go into detail, but I'm looking at various people. They don't seem to have the consciousness. I, of course, say Baba's name. Baba, Baba, I love you, Baba, I love you. We work with effort and grace, which was a fantastic catalyst toward my question. But still in all, I mean, my question is not to be critical. I'm so grateful there were Baba lover communities. I'm so grateful I even heard the name Baba once in my life. I'm so grateful that Baba has strongly embraced me, and my wife as well. But do you have anything more to say in response to what I said? Because I don't know you, but my sense is you're an extremely discerning, reflective, and earnest Baba lover. And I don't know if there's anything more you want to say, but I just had to give you that example because, you know, we all live in reality as best we can. I'm not talking about the absolute reality of God realization, but we live in a reality that is not it's not like being on the center. And I'm a retired guy living in a beautiful community. I'm just amazed that, and there are many gatherings with Baba lovers that the hearts are so open. Oh, extraordinary.
I mean, Jeff, I don't know. I mean, I've got a few more thoughts for you know that I would say, but again, I don't claim to know your reality. What I do know for myself, you know, I just was involved in a number of conversations about a guy named Ken Wilber. Some of you may know who Ken Wilber is. He's kind of one of the preeminent sort of philosophical New Age, if not the most preeminent. He actually wrote a book with Dick Anthony, who's a long-term Baba, and very interesting guy. And he talks about, as I understand, I'm not a student of Ken Wilber's, but he talks about growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. And I think that's a pretty good, you know, a good way of looking at it. Is we need to grow up. We need to sort of, start taking on a sense of responsibility, in our relationship with Bob. I'm talking about myself now. You can take this forward, but taking on a sense of responsibility. That Bob has said, "Be true to the trust I repose in you." That's growing up. Then it's cleaning up to me is dealing with my own wounds, my own psychological, emotional wounds that I carry with me. And however I do that, and Bob has given me unbelievably wonderful resources, and I've done a huge amount of work in that arena. And it's, to me, that's part of taking responsibility for myself. And then showing up means being out there and really saying, okay, I'll put myself out there. I'll make myself available to do his, to try to really live the life that I feel he's asking of me. So that, that's a big picture way of responding to what you're saying. So,
Thank you. That is deeply appreciated. And I'm sure you're one of many, many, many who do that. And hearing you say that, that's not why I asked the question, but thank you. That means a lot to me. And you're vulnerable and you're sincere. And man, I like you. Not only do I like you, but I love you. So we're going both. I don't want this to sound, I'm going both ways. And I'm a happily married guy. Hope this is being taped. I want to try to answer, let other people ask their question because I have maybe one more. So whoever else would like to ask, please take the mic.
Anybody else have?
I would like to just comment. I would just like to comment about the idea of loving everybody. I don't think Baba has set that as our goal. He, in fact, has given us a special path, which is to love Baba or love God in everyone and everything. And that makes it easy because all we have to do is there's only one to love instead of billions or trillions or whatever is, whatever it is. Once we hone in on that and are able to see God in everyone and everything and get by the ones who are really appeal and charm us, or the ones that drive us crazy, who we can't get by their personalities or something like that. That becomes not an issue, but it takes a tremendous amount of focus and practice. So, but it is available. That's what Baba's here to say. He says, love God in all the beings.
Anybody else have anything you want to, who has not said anything so far? Who wants to add anything? Raise anything?
When Baba speaks about the dream, that we're living in a dream, we just see illusion. I can't quote Baba's words, but a number of times he just basically says, we do not experience reality. Someday we will. Especially when Baba says that first syllable or word. How do you deal with that question? Because the best I've come up with is life is a dream. Life is a dream of thoughts. And most of those thoughts are in the past or in the future. So I don't a lot of the time experience what's happening now. Life is a dream of thoughts. Why do so many people, including me, keep on talking to myself about my own story? It's a habit, it's a samskara. Could you talk about how you experience reality at whatever level you do? I know it's a question, I can't even articulate what I really want to ask you, but I'm going to ask you to intuitively, heart to heart, try to respond to me because you're a pretty sensitive psychic guy.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I can respond completely to what you're saying, but I'll tell you some things that come up in me that might be tangentially related to what you're saying. One thing I'd say about illusion, there's two ways of looking at illusion. I know some, going back to the interview, there was a Facebook page that was created for people to either respond, to give their feedback or their comments or whatever about the interview. And so what was interesting to me on that page was how a number of people started saying, well, these people, and and they named different spiritual figures, they have way more followers than Mayor Baba. So they claim to be Avatar. And that's sort of like, as proof of something. And there was a lot of that. There wasn't just one or two. I was really taken with that. And so that was the only thing I responded to. And I said, I think you guys are living an illusion by correlating numbers of followers with spiritual status. And I said, I think that's illusion. Now, that's a version of illusion that we actually do have access to. We don't have access to illusion as in we're in the realm of duality and the reality is oneness, and it's absolute. We don't have, at least I don't have access to that state at this point in my own state of development, but I do have access to the illusion where there's false valuation that goes on. And that we do have the opportunity to take a stand on that truth. And Baba said, take your stand on truth. That's one of Baba's admonitions to us. Take your stand on truth. Well, the truth, we have a perception of truth. It's not absolute truth, but we do have, through Baba, we've been given an opening into a window into a higher level of truth. And Baba did say, and this is a quote from Baba, and I can give you the quote because it's one of the ones that I hold most dear to me personally. He said, the truth of one's own perception and realization is the only road by which wholeness may be restored to one's inner psychic being. In no other way can man be freed from the colossal chains that tie the ego mind to the world of illusion. The last part is a slight, most of that's exact, so part of the slight. And you can find that in Life at its Best, page 26, under the title Hypocrisy. And it's an extraordinary statement by Baba, which says we have to live according to the truth of our own perception and realization. We can't pretend to live on some other level. He said it won't take you anywhere. The only ground you can walk on that's going to take you anywhere is where we actually tune into and stand on the truth of our own perception and realization. So those are my thoughts, Jeff, in response to what you're saying.
Thank you.
And, Elizabeth, your hand's up.
Hi, Dan.
Yeah.
That was an amazing presentation you made. I just can't get over the range of really difficult topics that you covered, and you did it so that people could follow it, although to really understand that they'd have to read all those books. Anyway, I was flipping through the discourses to see if I could find that example that Ron brought up and that you talked about, but the only one I could find is the one about the guy who wanted to to be an aspirant, and he went into the jungle, and he kept doing what he was asked to do, repeating God's name, and finally he was confronted by a bear, and he ran at top speed to Pune, to a shop in Pune, and that was the end of his renunciation. So that's the only one that, but I do remember that story, and I'm trying to think, where did it come from?
It's in one of the discourses. I can't quote a chapter and verse. Somebody who's a discourse.
Okay. Well, anyway, I tried to find it.
I'm pretty sure.
The other thing, when you were speaking, you talked about intuition, but in the discourse on faith, it talks about intuition, but it talks about pure intuition. And I think that's where people go wrong. I mean, we think we are operating on intuition, but it's not pure because it's clouded by our desires and wants. And people forget that one word. And when you forget that word, you can really be misled into what it is you just want to do, as opposed to, I mean, how does one achieve pure intuition? How does one become so selfless and so committed to truth that one can see clearly? I think you can at times. I think that's what prayer and and taking it to Baba and really listening, even if the result is not something you want, is what can lead you there. And then double checking it with people who have this same value system to make sure you're not deceiving yourself. But I think, at least I'm constantly on the lookout for, how am I deceiving myself? What is not true about what I'm seeing? How can I, in questioning, especially if somebody brings something to my attention. And then sometimes I find out that it's not me, it's that other person's perception is off kilter. And that has been a really hard lesson for me to learn. But it is really interesting what happens when you do that, because you end up laughing about situations which could easily make you mad when you realize that the other person's way of thinking is, that particular part is just at a level, a different consciousness, and you can see it, whereas before you might not have. But at the same time, you have to always question oneself. I mean, I believe, because it's so hard to maintain that equipoise and to see clearly.
I everything you say resonates with me, Elizabeth. It all matches my own experience. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And talking about intuition and Baba's wish and all that, I mean, my plan for today had nothing to do with listening to this, to the Buddha thing. But sometimes Baba snags you and you end up in places you don't expect to be. That happened with me, in January. I ended up in a meeting with Angela that I didn't, and Ruthie was there. I didn't intend to go to it. And I ended up doing this. I ended up with a task that I've almost finished. But and the same thing happened the day that Zoe had her stroke. I didn't intend to be there that day. And that day was massively important to me and has had repercussions for the last year and a half. In ways I could never have anticipated and still don't fully understand. But sometimes you just have to settle into those things that that you're not intending to do, but you get drawn into. And those are the coincidences for me anyway.
But I think all of that also, to me, relates to surrender. Let me say this one thing that I want to get Corinne in here. The one topic that Rick did not ask me about, and it didn't occur to me until afterwards to encourage him to talk to me about this, was surrender. Because I happen to think that that's actually the major, his listenership is actually quite different from the Baba world, because his listenership in general, and I'm not going to say absolutely because he's got a huge listenership of many, many kinds of people, but a lot of them are people that do not relate to the idea of masters. They relate to teachers. And Rick himself has a very strong teacher paradigm, which I respect and I appreciate. But we're in a different paradigm in the Baba world. We're in the master paradigm, where there is a being who we take as being God, as we take as being infinitely conscious. And so we are in the position of accepting the need to surrender to him. I believe that that's the position that Baba lovers are in. And that's really a very high risk proposition for many, many people for reasons that are extremely easy to understand to me. I mean, I really get
I have a problem with that concept because it's kind of like how I don't think I could ever be, and nothing against this particular, well, I won't even say it. I just won't say it. Anyway, I have a hard time with that concept. And Baba also said, don't say you're anything you're not. So even though I know that Bible lovers are going to say, oh, that Elizabeth, she's not really a Bible lover. I mean, they can say that, whatever. You know, I have comfort because Mara wrote me in a letter, you know, if you don't think, you know, Baba is like Jesus, you know, don't worry about it. Take him as your friend. He'll be the best one you ever have. And everybody's on a different path and everybody can't do it the same way. And I'm just doing it the best I can. And surrender is super hard for me. Because you know, and the idea of things of destroying the intellect, that's, I mean, I'm like a brain. It's like the antithesis of what I think is natural. And at the same time, I really do believe in well, basically all his concepts and precepts about truth and love. And when all else fails, I go back to the Prem Ashram boys. You know, Baba said, seek love, seek Prem. If you find Prem, you'll find me. So if all else fails, I just say, okay, what is the most loving thing I can do in whatever the circumstance is? You know, if I can't understand it, if I can't rationalize it, if I can't tolerate whatever, then I think that is such an important thing that Baba said. Seek Prem.
Let me get Corinne and then
Oh,
Ruth.
sorry, Dan. Daniel.
Corinne. Thank you. Hey.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. When I think I notice my intuition, I take responsibility for looking at what happens when I make a certain decision. Does it seem that I was on target or maybe not? The pandemic has been really good for me in that way. A lot of time to ponder things on my own. But I initially had a feeling response, Jeff, to what you were saying, because I can identify with that frustration. So how do I do it? How do I not react? You know, I've got these things that just I continue to react to. And Baba says, don't put it into action. That's one thing he says. Can't say that I'm always on target with that. I'll bet you have a whole lot of things that you could pull forth if you went to looking within what you've read. But in this book, The Treasures, it may not say exactly the cosmology that we get from reading something like Infinite Intelligence or God Speaks. It's earlier than that. But these people we have known, most of us, and it is, for me, such a treasure to experience to read of their experience of Baba. And in this book, if you have it around, I was looking for one part and found something else. There are two articles that Kitty Davy wrote. In one, she quotes Baba with the "think always of me." You know, so that's the message we get. My name will protect you from the mosquitoes. Just take my name and what's going on inside, as long as you're not reacting, as long as you're not acting, do not judge yourself for. It's a long road for all of us. And I can't find the one. So if it means you get to plow through this and find it for yourself, there was an article that Kitty had published. I think these were all published in the journal, where she goes into a somewhat lengthy explanation of, you think your thoughts, and the thoughts you think are going to be the ones that direct your life. So everywhere, be it something that we now consider to be the most refined, or it was somebody's experience, we hear it over and over again. And we don't, I take comfort in thinking that I don't have to get there this lifetime. That's my surrender, that I will only go as far as Baba can help me go. So, and I have an appointment. I'm going to have to leave here in just a moment. So,
Corinne,
what
thank
else,
you.
Ruthie?
Thank you. Thank you, Corinne.
Sure.
You know,
1,000 thank yous. You gave me some very good insight direction. And thank you, Baba, for letting Corinne speak so beautifully, and Dan and everybody here. That's it.
So, Corinne, I just want to say one thing that occurred to me while you were speaking. So it's
Mhm.
not a direct response to you, but it is sort of my thought, what thoughts came to me. I was thinking my own experience with intuition. I learned a lot about intuition from Kitty. I mean, that's who I really learned about intuition from. And it wasn't like she sat me down and taught me about intuition, but she transmitted to me a lot of understandings that I've worked with in my life. And one of them was that, and I think I addressed this in the interview with him about when we talked about intuition, is I think it's one thing to share my intuitions with other people. And like Don Stevens has a whole thing about that. So I'm not, people that are really, he's a very strong believer in what he called truing his intuitions. I'm not a disbeliever in it, but I'm also a believer in learning from my experience with my intuition and taking the risks that go with acting upon my intuitions rather than trying to sort of justify them or rationalize them or validate them externally. And so, and I got that more from Kitty, from what I was but that was transmitted to me. So I'm not saying, I'm not, or I felt it transmitted to me. I don't know what was transmitted, but I felt that transmitted to me. And what I got from her was the need to be willing to really live by my own inner truth about this and to learn to trust my intuition, even if it comes at stages and at the cost of quote mistakes along the way. That was that was going to be a faster, more stronger route for learning to live a life guided by my own intuition than trying to do it, through the externalization of my intuitive process. Now that's me. Other people, as I said, Don Stevens is a big believer in have a group of people, put out your intuitions and see if it resonates with people. And I say, good on you, Don. You're obviously a great man and I have great respect for you, but it's not my way, I should say. Ruth, you had a comment?
Well, geez. Yeah, I think for me also, intuition is a very private thing. And I don't share what I perceive as intuition, but I do know one thing. It takes a lot of clearing out for me. So if somebody sparks something in me, I have to look at the spark and then I got to follow it to the root, which is me. And then I have to figure out how much is mine, how much isn't mine. Where have I evolved with that? Have I not evolved with that? If I haven't evolved with that, how do I ask Baba to help me in a sincere way? So it takes a lot of that. It doesn't just, it takes a lot. And if somebody mirrors something at me, I have to look at myself. So that's just my little bit. But what I really am curious too, Dan, is that beautiful painting behind you. Can you tell us a little about it?
Will, and I'll show it to you. So believe it or not, this is the painting that was behind Kitty when she sat in her book room. And she bought it from Will David. And it's called Happiness. And I don't know if you can see, there's a horse there, and there's a train here. There's Baba there. That's what that painting is. And when she died, it was given to me. That's her gift. So, yeah. I'm
Right,
so
Dan,
glad.
what is that thing that's in the center left? What is that?
This here?
Yes.
I mean, I think it's a horse, but Will David, it could be any.
I loved it, Will David stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this was in Kitty's office, is that right?
Yeah, it was in the book room right behind her.
So, I saw that when you were talking, and I really liked it, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought it was about evolution. But I must have seen it when I visited Kitty. So
Yeah.
that's amazing that you've got that painting.
I know. I'm so happy to have it.
Wow,
Mhm.
Well,
that's really nice.
I don't know if there are any more questions, but
It seems like a good place to end.
yes, maybe just a moment of silence together. Dan, again, I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Baba. What an
Thank you all.
inspired gift. Cheba.
Sheba.
Cheba.
Sheba.